Book 6. Chapter 1. Having stated in a former part of this treatise that men should choose the mean instead of either the excess or defect, and that the mean is according to the dictates of right reason, we will now proceed to explain this term. For in all the habits which we have expressly mentioned, as likewise in all the others, there is, so to speak, a mark with his eye fixed on which the man who has reason tightens or slacks his rope, and there is a certain limit of those mean states which we say are in accordance with right reason, and lie between excess on the one hand and defect on the other. Now to speak thus is true enough but conveys no very definite meaning, as, in fact, in all other pursuits requiring attention and diligence on which skill and science are brought to bear, it is quite true of course to say that men are either to labor nor relax too much or too little, but in moderation, and as right reason directs. Yet if this were all a man had, he would not be greatly the wiser, as, for instance, if in answer to the question, what are proper applications to the body, he were to be told, oh, of course, whatever the science of medicine, and in such manner as the physician directs. And so in respect of the mental states it is requisite not merely that this should be true which has been already stated, but further that it should be expressly laid down what right reason is, and what is the definition of it. Chapter 2. Now in our division of the excellences of the soul, we said there were two classes, the moral and the intellectual. The former we have already gone through, and we will now proceed to speak of the others, premising a few words respecting the soul itself. It was stated before, you will remember, that the soul consists of two parts, the rational and irrational. We must now make a similar division of the rational. Let it be understood then that there are two parts of the soul possessed of reason, one whereby we realize those existences whose causes cannot be otherwise than they are, and one whereby we realize those which can be otherwise than they are, for there must be, answering to things generically different parts of the soul naturally adapted to each. Since these parts of the soul possess their knowledge in virtue of a certain resemblance and appropriateness in themselves to the objects of which they are percipients, and let us name the former, that which is apt to know, the latter, that which is apt to calculate, because deliberating and calculating are the same, and no one ever deliberates about things which cannot be otherwise than they are, and so the calculative will be one part of the rational faculty of the soul. We must discover, then, which is the best state of each of these, because that will be the excellence of each, and this again is relative to the work each has to do. There are in the soul three functions on which depend moral action and truth: sense, intellect, appetition, whether vague desire or definite will. Now of these sense is the originating cause of no moral action, as is seen from the fact that brutes have sense but are in no way partakers of moral action. Intellect and will are thus connected. What in the intellectual operation is affirmation and negation, that in the will is pursuit and avoidance. And so, since moral virtue is a state apt to exercise moral choice, and moral choice is will consequent on deliberation, the reason must be true and the will right, to constitute good moral choice, and what the reason affirms the will must pursue. Now this intellectual operation and this truth is what bears upon moral action. Of course truth and falsehood must be the good and the bad of that intellectual operation which is purely speculative, and concern neither with action nor production, because this is manifestly the work of every intellectual faculty, while of the faculty which is of a mixed practical and intellectual nature, the work is that truth which, as I have described above, corresponds to the right movement of the will. Now the starting point of moral action is moral choice, I mean, what actually sets it in motion, not the final cause, and of moral choice, appetition, and reason directed to a certain result, and thus moral choice is neither independent of intellect, i.e. intellectual operation, nor of a certain moral state, for right or wrong action cannot be independently of operation of the intellect and moral character. But operation of the intellect by itself moves nothing, only when directed to a certain result, i.e. exercised in moral action. I say nothing of its being exercised in production, because this function is originated by the former. For every one who makes with a view to somewhat further, and that which is or may be made, is not an end in itself, but only relatively to somewhat else, and belonging to someone. Whereas that which is or may be done is an end in itself, because acting well is an end in itself, and this is the object of the will, And so moral choice is either intellect put in a position of will ing, or appetition subjected to an intellectual process. And such a cause is man. But nothing which is done and past can be the object of moral choice. For instance, no man chooses to have sacked Troy, because, in fact, no one ever deliberates about what is past, but only about that which is future, and which may therefore be influenced, whereas what has been cannot not have been. And so Agathon is right in saying, of this alone is deity bereft, to make undone whatever hath been done. Thus then truth is the work of both the intellectual parts of the soul. Those states therefore are the excellences of each in which each will best attain truth. Chapter 3. Commencing then from the point stated above, we will now speak of these excellences again. Let those faculties whereby the soul attains truth in affirmation or negation be assumed to be in number 5, viz. Art, knowledge, practical wisdom, science, intuition, supposition and opinion I do not include, because by these one may go wrong. What knowledge is plain from the following of considerations, if one is to speak accurately, instead of being led away by resemblances. For we all conceive that what we strictly speaking know cannot be otherwise than it is, because as to those things which can be otherwise than they are, we are uncertain whether they are or are not, the moment they cease to be within the sphere of our actual observation. So then, whatever comes within the range of knowledge is by necessity, and therefore eternal, because all things are so which exist necessarily, and all eternal things are without beginning, and indestructible. Again, all knowledge is thought to be capable of being taught, and what comes within its range capable of being learned. And all teaching is based upon previous knowledge, a statement you will find in the Analytics also, for there are two ways of teaching, by syllogism and by induction. In fact, induction is the source of universal propositions, and syllogism reasons from these universals. Syllogism then may reason from principles which cannot be themselves proved syllogistically, and therefore must by induction. So knowledge is a state or mental faculty apt to demonstrate syllogistically, and see, as in the Analytics, because a man, strictly and properly speaking, knows, when he establishes his conclusion in a certain way, and the principles are known to him, for if they are not better known to him than the conclusion, such knowledge as he has will be merely accidental. Let thus much be accepted as a definition of knowledge. Chapter 4. Matter which may exist otherwise than it actually does in any given case, commonly called contingent, is of two kinds, that which is the object of making, and that which is the object of doing. Now making and doing are two different things, as we show in the exoteric treatise, and so that state of mind, conjoined with reason, which is apt to do, is distinct from that also conjoined with reason, which is apt to make. And for this reason they are not included one by the other, that is, doing is not making, nor making doing. Now as architecture is an art, and is the same as a certain state of mind, conjoined with reason, which is apt to make, and as there is no art which is not such a state, nor any such state which is not an art, in its strict and proper sense, must be a state of mind, conjoined with true reason, apt to make. Now all art has to do with production, and contrivance, and seeing how any of those things may be produced which may either be or not be, and the origination of which rests with the maker and not with the thing made. And so neither things which exist or come into being necessarily, nor things in the way of nature, come under the province of art, because these are self-originating. And since making and doing are distinct, art must be concerned with the former, and not the latter. And in a certain sense art and fortune are concerned with the same things, as Agathon says by the way, art fortune loves, and is of her beloved. So art, as has been stated, is a certain state of mind, apt to make, conjoined with true reason. Its absence, on the contrary, is the same state conjoined with false reason, and both are employed upon contingent matter. Chapter 5. As for practical wisdom, we shall ascertain its nature by examining to what kind of persons we in common language ascribe it. It is thought then to be the property of the practically wise man to be able to deliberate well respecting what is good and expedient for himself, not in any definite line, as what is conducive to health or strength, but what to living will. A proof of this is that we call men wise in this or that, when they calculate well with a view to some good end in a case where there is no definite rule. And so, in a general way of speaking, the man who is good at deliberation will be practically wise. Now no man deliberates respecting things which cannot be otherwise than they are, nor such as lie not within the range of his own action. And so, since knowledge requires strict demonstrative reasoning, of which contingent matter does not admit, I say contingent matter, because all matters of deliberation must be contingent, and deliberation cannot take place with respect to things which are necessarily. Practical wisdom cannot be knowledge nor art, nor the former, because what falls under the province of doing must be contingent, not the latter, because doing and making are different in kind. It remains then that it must be a state of mind true, conjoined with reason, and apt to do, having for its object those things which are good or bad for man, because of making something beyond itself is always the object, but cannot be of doing because the very well-doing is in itself an end. For this reason we think Pericles and men of that stamp to be practically wise, because they can see what is good for themselves and for men in general, and we also think those to be such who are skilled in domestic management or civil government. In fact, this is the reason why we call the habit of perfected self-mastery by the name which in Greek it bears, etymologically signifying that which preserves the practical wisdom, for what it does preserve is the notion I have mentioned, i.e. of one's own true interest. For it is not every kind of notion which the pleasant and the painful corrupt and pervert, as, for instance, that the 3 angles of every rectilineal triangle are equal to 2 right angles, but only those bearing on moral action. For the principles of the matters of moral action are the final cause of them. Now to the man who has been corrupted by reason of pleasure or pain the principle immediately becomes obscured, nor does he see that it is his duty to choose and act in each instance with a view to this final cause and by reason of it, for viciousness has a tendency to destroy the moral principle. And so practical wisdom must be a state conjoined with reason, true, having human good for its object, and apt to do. Then again art admits of degrees of excellence, but practical wisdom does not, and in art he who goes wrong purposely is preferable to him who does so unwittingly, but not so in respect of practical wisdom or the other virtues. It plainly is then an excellence of a certain kind, and not an art. Now as there are 2 parts of the soul which have reason, it must be the excellence of the opinionative, which we called before calculative or deliberative, because both opinion and practical wisdom are exercised upon contingent matter. And further, it is not simply a state conjoined with reason, as is proved by the fact that such a state may be forgotten and so lost while practical wisdom cannot. Chapter 6. Now knowledge is a conception concerning universals and necessary matter, and there are of course certain first principles in all trains of demonstrative reasoning, that is of all knowledge, because this is connected with reasoning that faculty, then, which takes in the first principles of that which comes under the range of knowledge, cannot be either knowledge, or art, or practical wisdom, not knowledge, because what is the object of knowledge must be derived from demonstrative reasoning, not either of the other 2, because they are exercised upon contingent matter only. Nor can it be science which takes in these, because the scientific man must in some cases depend on demonstrative reasoning. It comes then to this, since the faculties whereby we always attain truth and are never deceived when dealing with matter necessary or even contingent are knowledge, practical wisdom, science, and intuition, and the faculty which takes in first principles cannot be any of the 3 first. The last, namely intuition, must be it which performs this function. Chapter 7. Science is a term we use principally in 2 meanings. In the first place, in the arts we ascribe it to those who carry their arts to the highest accuracy. Phidias, for instance, we call a scientific or cunning sculptor, Polyclitus a scientific or cunning statuary, meaning, in this instance, nothing else by science than an excellence of art. In the other sense, we think some to be scientific in a general way, not in any particular line or in any particular thing, just as Homer says of a man in his Margits, him the gods made neither a digger of the ground, nor plowman, nor in any other way scientific. So it is plain that science must mean the most accurate of all knowledge. But if so, then the scientific man must not merely know the deductions from the first principles but be in possession of truth respecting the first principles. so that science must be equivalent to intuition and knowledge. It is, so to speak, knowledge of the most precious objects, with a head on. I say of the most precious things, because it is absurd to suppose pi omicron lambda iota kappa, or practical wisdom, to be the highest, unless it can be shown that man is the most excellent of all that exists in the universe. Now if healthy and good are relative terms, differing when applied to men or to fish, but white and straight are the same always, men must allow that the scientific is the same always, but the practically wise varies, for whatever provides all things well for itself, to this they would apply the term practically wise, and commit these matters to it, which is the reason, by the way, that they call some brutes practically wise, such that is as plainly have a faculty of forethought, respecting their own subsistence. And it is quite plain that science and pi omicron lambda iota kappa cannot be identical, because if men give the name of science to that faculty which is employed upon what is expedient for themselves, there will be many instead of one, because there is not one and the same faculty employed on the good of all animals collectively. Unless in the same sense as you may say there is one art of healing with respect to all living beings. If it is urged that man is superior to all other animals, that makes no difference, for there are many other things more godlike in their nature than man, as, most obviously, the elements of which the universe is composed. It is plain then that science is the union of knowledge and intuition, and has for its objects those things which are most precious in their nature. Accordingly, Anaxagoras, Thales, and men of that stamp people call scientific, but not practically wise because they see them ignorant of what concerns themselves, and they say that what they know is quite out of the common run certainly, and wonderful, and hard, and very fine no doubt, but still useless because they do not seek after what is good for them as men. Chapter 8. But practical wisdom is employed upon human matters, and such as are objects of deliberation, for we say that to deliberate well is most peculiarly the work of the man who possesses this wisdom, and no man deliberates about things which cannot be otherwise than they are, nor about any save those that have some definite end and this end good resulting from moral action. And the man to whom we should give the name of good in counsel, simply and without modification, is he who, in the way of calculation, has a capacity for attaining that of practical goods which is the best for man. Nor again does practical wisdom consist in a knowledge of general principles only, but it is necessary that one should know also the particular details, because it is apt to act, and action is concerned with details, for which reason sometimes men who have not much knowledge are more practical than others who have, among others, they who derive all they know from actual experience. Suppose a man to know, for instance, that light meats are easy of digestion and wholesome, but not what kinds of meat are light, he will not produce a healthy state. That man will have a much better chance of doing so, who knows that the flesh of birds is light and wholesome. Since then practical wisdom is apt to act, one ought to have both kinds of knowledge, or, if only one, the knowledge of details rather than of principles. So there will be in respect of practical wisdom the distinction of supreme and subordinate. Further, policy and practical wisdom are the same mental state, but the point of view is not the same. Of practical wisdom exerted upon a community, that which I would call the supreme is the faculty of legislation. The subordinate, which is concerned with the details, generally has the common name pi omicron lambda iota kappa, and its functions are action and deliberation, for the particular enactment is a matter of action, being the ultimate issue of this branch of practical wisdom. And therefore people commonly say that these men alone are really engaged in government, because they alone act, filling the same place relatively to legislators that workmen do to a master. Again, that is thought to be practical wisdom in the most proper sense, which has for its object the interest of the individual, and this usually appropriates the common name. The others are called respectively domestic management, legislation, executive government, divided into two branches, deliberative and judicial. Now, of course, knowledge for oneself is one kind of knowledge, but it admits of many shades of difference, and it is a common notion that the man who knows and busies himself about his own concerns merely is the man of practical wisdom, while they who extend their solicitude to society at large are considered meddlesome. Euripides has thus embodied this sentiment, How, says one of his characters, how foolish am I, who whereas I might have shared equally, idly numbered among the multitude of the army for them that are busy and meddlesome, Jove hates, because the generality of mankind seek their own good and hold that this is their proper business. It is then from this opinion that the notion has arisen that such men are the practically wise. And yet it is just possible that the good of the individual cannot be secured independently of connection with a family or a community. And again, how a man should manage his own affairs is sometimes not quite plain, and must be made a matter of inquiry. A corroboration of what I have said is the fact that the young come to be geometricians, and mathematicians, and scientific in such matters, but it is not thought that a young man can come to be possessed of practical wisdom. Now the reason is that this wisdom has for its object particular facts, which come to be known from experience, which a young man has not because it is produced only by length of time. By the way, a person might also inquire why a boy may be made a mathematician but not scientific or a natural philosopher. Is not this the reason? That mathematics are taken in by the process of abstraction, but the principles of science and natural philosophy must be gained by experiment, and the latter young men talk of but do not realize, while the nature of the former is plain and clear. Again, in matter of practice, error attaches either to the general rule, in the process of deliberation, or to the particular fact. For instance, this would be a general rule: all water of a certain gravity is bad. The particular fact: this water is of that gravity. And that practical wisdom is not knowledge is plain, for it has to do with the ultimate issue, as has been said, because every object of action is of this nature. To intuition it is opposed, for this takes in those principles which cannot be proved by reasoning, while practical wisdom is concerned with the ultimate particular fact which cannot be realized by knowledge but by sense. I do not mean one of the five senses, but the same by which we take in the mathematical fact that no rectilineal figure can be contained by less than 3 lines, i.e. that a triangle is the ultimate figure, because here also is a stopping point. This, however, is sense rather than practical wisdom, which is of another kind. Chapter 9. Now the acts of inquiring and deliberating differ, though deliberating is a kind of inquiring. We ought to ascertain about good counsel likewise what it is, whether a kind of knowledge, or opinion, or happy conjecture, or some other kind of faculty. Knowledge it obviously is not, because men do not inquire about what they know, and good counsel is a kind of deliberation, and the man who is deliberating is inquiring and calculating. Neither is it happy conjecture, because this is independent of reasoning, and a rapid operation. But men deliberate a long time, and it is a common saying that one should execute speedily what has been resolved upon in deliberation, but deliberate slowly. Quick perception of causes again is a different faculty from good counsel, for it is a species of happy conjecture. Nor is good counsel opinion of any kind. Well then, since he who deliberates ill goes wrong, and he who deliberates well does so rightly, it is clear that good counsel is rightness of some kind, but not of knowledge nor of opinion, for knowledge cannot be called right because it cannot be wrong, and rightness of opinion is truth. And again, all which is the object of opinion is definitely marked out. Still, however, good counsel is not independent of reason. Does it remain then that it is a rightness of intellectual operation simply, because this does not amount to an assertion, and the objection to opinion was that it is not a process of inquiry but already a definite assertion, whereas whosoever deliberates, whether well or ill, is engaged in inquiry and calculation. Well, good counsel is a rightness of deliberation, and so the first question must regard the nature and objects of deliberation. Now remember, rightness is an equivocal term. We plainly do not mean rightness of any kind whatever. The capro alpha tau, for instance, or the bad man, will obtain by his calculation what he sets before him as an object, and so he may be said to have deliberated rightly in one sense, but will have attained a great evil. Whereas to have deliberated well is thought to be a good, because good counsel is rightness of deliberation of such a nature as is apt to attain good. But even this again you may get by false reasoning, and hit upon the right effect though not through right means, your middle term being fallacious. And so either will this be yet good counsel in consequence of which you get what you ought but not through proper means. Again, one man may hit on a thing after long deliberation, another quickly, And so that before described will not be yet good counsel, but the rightness must be with reference to what is expedient, and you must have a proper end in view, pursue it in a right manner and right time. Once more, one may deliberate well either generally or towards some particular end. Good counsel in the general then is that which goes right towards that which is the end in a general way of consideration, in particular, that which does so towards some particular end. Since then deliberating well is a quality of men possessed of practical wisdom, good counsel must be rightness in respect of what conduces to a given end, of which practical wisdom is the true conception. Chapter 10. There is too the faculty of judiciousness, and also its absence, in virtue of which we call men judicious or the contrary. Now judiciousness is either entirely identical with knowledge or opinion, for then all would have been judicious, nor is it any one specific science, as medical science whose object matter is things wholesome, or geometry whose object matter is magnitude, for it has not for its object things which always exist and are immutable, nor of those things which come into being just any which may chance, but those in respect of which a man might doubt and deliberate. And so it has the same object matter as practical wisdom, yet the two faculties are not identical, because practical wisdom has the capacity for commanding and taking the initiative, for its end is what one should do or not do, but judiciousness is only apt to decide upon suggestions, though we do in Greek put, well, on to the faculty, and its concrete noun, these really mean exactly the same as the plain words. And judiciousness is either the having practical wisdom, nor attaining it, but just as learning is termed sigma upsilon iota alpha iota when a man uses his knowledge, so judiciousness consists in employing the opinionative faculty in judging concerning those things which come within the province of practical wisdom, when another enunciates them, and not judging merely, but judging well. The faculty called opinion, in right of which we call men thankful, or say they have opinion, is the right judgment of the equitable man. A proof of which is that we most commonly say that the equitable man has a tendency to make allowance, and the making allowance in certain cases is equitable. And sorry, the word denoting allowance, is right opinion having a capacity of making equitable decisions. By right, I mean that of the truthful man. Chapter 11. Now all these mental states tend to the same object, as indeed common language leads us to expect. I mean, we speak of gamma mueta, judiciousness, practical wisdom, and practical intuition, attributing the possession of gamma mueta and practical intuition to the same individuals whom we denominate practically wise and judicious, because all these faculties are employed upon the extremes, i.e. on particular details, and in right of his aptitude for deciding on the matters which come within the province of the practically wise. A man is judicious and possessed of good gamma mueta, i.e. he is disposed to make allowance, for considerations of equity are entertained by all good men alike in transactions with their fellows. And all matters of moral action belong to the class of particulars, otherwise called extremes, for the man of practical wisdom must know them, and judiciousness and gamma mueta are concerned with matters of moral actions, which are extremes. Intuition, moreover, takes in the extremes at both ends. I mean, the first and last terms must be taken in not by reasoning but by intuition, so that intuition comes to be of two kinds, and that which belongs to strict demonstrative reasonings takes in immutable, i.e. necessary, first terms, while that which is employed in practical matters takes in the extreme, the contingent, and the minor premise. For the minor premises are the source of the final cause, universals being made up out of particulars. To take in these, of course, we must have sense, i.e. in other words practical intuition. And for this reason these are thought to be simply gifts of nature, and whereas no man is thought to be scientific by nature, men are thought to have opinion, and judiciousness, and practical intuition, a proof of which is that we think these faculties are a consequence even of particular ages, and this given age has practical intuition and opinion, we say, as if under the notion that nature is the cause. And thus intuition is both the beginning and end, because the proofs are based upon the one kind of extremes and concern the other. And so one should attend to the undemonstrable dicta and opinions of the skillful, the old and the practically wise, no less than to those which are based on strict reasoning, because they see aright, having gained their power of moral vision from experience. Chapter 12. Well, we have now stated the nature and objects of practical wisdom and science respectively, and that they belong each to a different part of the soul. But I can conceive a person questioning their utility. Science, he would say, concerns itself with none of the causes of human happiness, for it has nothing to do with producing anything. Practical wisdom has this recommendation, I grant, but where is the need of it, since its province is those things which are just and honorable, and good for man, and these are the things which the good man as such does. But we are not a bit the more apt to do them because we know them. Since the moral virtues are habits, just as we are not more apt to be healthy, or in good condition from mere knowledge of what relates to these, I mean, of course, things so called not from their producing health, etc., but from their evidencing it in a particular subject, for we are not more apt to be healthy and in good condition merely from knowing the art of medicine or training. If it be urged that knowing what is good does not by itself make a practically wise man but becoming good, still this wisdom will be no use either to those that are good, and so have it already, or to those who have it not, because it will make no difference to them whether they have it themselves or put themselves under the guidance of others who have, and we might be contented to be in respect of this as in respect of health. For though we wish to be healthy, still we do not set about learning the art of healing. Furthermore, it would seem to be strange that, though lower in the scale than science, it is to be its master, which it is, because whatever produces results takes the rule and directs in each matter. This then is what we are to talk about, for these are the only points now raised. Now first we say that being respectively excellences of different parts of the soul, they must be choice-worthy, even on the supposition that they either of them produce results. In the next place we say that they do produce results, that science makes happiness, not as the medical art but as healthiness makes health, because, being a part of virtue in its most extensive sense, it makes a man happy by being possessed and by working. Next, man's work as man is accomplished by virtue of practical wisdom and moral virtue, the latter giving the right aim and direction, the former the right means to its attainment. But of the fourth part of the soul, the mere nutritive principle, there is no such excellence, because nothing is in its power to do or leave undone. As to our not being more apt to do what is noble and just by reason of possessing practical wisdom, we must begin a little higher up, taking this for our starting point. As we say that men may do things in themselves just and yet not be just men, for instance, when men do what the laws require of them, either against their will, or by reason of ignorance or something else, at all events not for the sake of the things themselves, and yet they do what they ought and all that the good man should do. So it seems that to be a good man one must do each act in a particular frame of mind. I mean from moral choice and for the sake of the things themselves which are done. Now it is virtue which makes the moral choice right, but whatever is naturally required to carry out that choice comes under the province not of virtue but of a different faculty. We must halt, as it were, a while, and speak more clearly on these points. There is then a certain faculty, commonly named cleverness, of such a nature as to be able to do and attain whatever conduces to any given purpose. Now if that purpose be a good one, the faculty is praiseworthy. If otherwise, it goes by a name which, denoting strictly the ability, implies the willingness to do anything. We accordingly call the practically wise clever, and also those who can and will do anything. Now practical wisdom is not identical with cleverness, nor is it without this power of adapting means to ends, but this eye of the soul, as we may call it, does not attain its proper state without goodness, as we have said before and as is quite plain, because the syllogisms into which moral action may be analyzed have for their major premise, since is the end and the chief good, fill up the blank with just anything you please. For we merely want to exhibit the form, so that anything will do. But how this blank should be filled is seen only by the good man, because vice distorts the moral vision and causes men to be deceived in respect of practical principles. It is clear, therefore, that a man cannot be a practically wise without being a good man. We must inquire again also about virtue, for it may be divided into natural virtue and matured, which two bear to each other a relation similar to that which practical wisdom bears to cleverness, one not of identity but resemblance. I speak of natural virtue, because men hold that each of the moral dispositions attached to us all somehow by nature. We have dispositions towards justice, self-mastery and courage, for instance, immediately from our birth. But still we seek goodness in its highest sense as something distinct from these, and that these dispositions should attach to us in a somewhat different fashion. Children and brutes have these natural states, but then they are plainly hurtful unless combined with an intellectual element. At least thus much is matter of actual experience and observation, that as a strong body destitute of sight must, if set in motion, fall violently because it has not sight, so it is also in the case we are considering. But if it can get the intellectual element, it then excels in acting. Just so the natural state of virtue, being like this strong body, will then be virtue in the highest sense when it too is combined with the intellectual element. So that, as in the case of the opinionative faculty, there are two forms, cleverness and practical wisdom, so also in the case of the moral there are two, natural virtue and matured, and of these the latter cannot be formed without practical wisdom. This leads some to say that all the virtues are merely intellectual practical wisdom, and Socrates was partly right in his inquiry and partly wrong in that he thought all the virtues were merely intellectual practical wisdom, right in saying they were not independent of that faculty. A proof of which is that now all, in defining virtue, add on this state, mentioning also to what standard it has reference, namely that, which is accordant with right reason. Now, right means in accordance with practical wisdom. So then all seem to have an instinctive notion that that state which is in accordance with practical wisdom is virtue. However, we must make a slight change in their statement, because that state is virtue, not merely which is in accordance with, but which implies the possession of right reason, which, upon such matters, is practical wisdom. The difference between us and Socrates is this: he thought the virtues were reasoning processes, i.e. that they were all instances of knowledge in its strict sense, but we say they implied the possession of reason. From what has been said then it is clear that one cannot be, strictly speaking, good without practical wisdom, nor practically wise without moral goodness. And by the distinction between natural and matured virtue one can meet the reasoning by which it might be argued that the virtues are separable, because the same man is not by nature most inclined to all at once, so that he will have acquired this one before he has that other. We would reply that this is possible with respect to the natural virtues, but not with respect to those in right of which a man is denominated simply good, because they will all belong to him together with the one faculty of practical wisdom. It is plain too that even had it not been apt to act we should have needed it, because it is the excellence of a part of the soul, and that the moral choice cannot be right independently of practical wisdom and moral goodness, because this gives the right end, that causes the doing these things which conduce to the end. Then again, it is not master of science, i.e. of the superior part of the soul, just as either is the healing art master of health, for it does not make use of it, but looks how it may come to be. So it commands for the sake of it, but does not command it. The objection is, in fact, about as valid as if a man should say pi omicron lambda iod kappa governs the gods, because it gives orders about all things in the community. Book 7. Chapter 1. Next we must take a different point to start from, and observe that of what is to be avoided in respect of moral character there are three forms: vice, imperfect self-control, and brutishness. Of the two former it is plain what the contraries are, for we call the one virtue, the other self-control, and as answering to brutishness it will be most suitable to assign superhuman, i.e. heroical and godlike virtue, as, in Homer, Priam says of Hector that he was very excellent, nor was he like the offspring of mortal man, but of a god. And so, if, as is commonly said, men are raised to the position of gods by reason of very high excellence in virtue, the state opposed to the brutish will plainly be of this nature, because as brutes are not virtuous or vicious, so either are gods. But the state of these is something more precious than virtue, of the former something different in kind from vice. And as, on the one hand, it is a rare thing for a man to be godlike, a term the Lacedaemonians are accustomed to use when they admire a man exceedingly, sigma epsilon omicron neuro they call him, so the brutish man is rare. The character is found most among barbarians, and some cases of it are caused by disease or maiming. Also such men as exceed in vice all ordinary measures we therefore designate by this opprobrious term. Well, we must in a subsequent place make some mention of this disposition, and vice has been spoken of before, For the present we must speak of imperfect self-control and its kindred faults of softness and luxury, on the one hand, and of self-control and endurance on the other, since we are to conceive of them, not as being the same states exactly as virtue and vice respectively, nor again as differing in kind. And we should adopt the same course as before, i.e. state the phenomena, and, after raising and discussing difficulties which suggest themselves, then exhibit, if possible, all the opinions afloat respecting these affections of the moral character, or, if not all, the greater part and the most important, for we may consider we have illustrated the matter sufficiently when the difficulties have been solved. And such theories as are most approved are left as a residuum. The chief points may be thus enumerated. It is thought: 1. That self-control and endurance belong to the class of things good and praiseworthy, while imperfect self-control and softness belong to that of things low and blameworthy. 2. That the man of self-control is identical with the man who is apt to abide by his resolution, and the man of imperfect self-control with him who is apt to depart from his resolution. 3. That the man of imperfect self-control does things at the instigation of his passions, knowing them to be wrong, while the man of self-control, knowing his lusts to be wrong, refuses, by the influence of reason, to follow their suggestions. 4. That the man of perfected self-mastery unites the qualities of self-control and endurance, and some say that every one who unites these is a man of perfect self-mastery, others do not. 5. Some confound the two characters of the man who has no self-control and the man of imperfect self-control, while others distinguish between them. 6. It is sometimes said that the man of practical wisdom cannot be a man of imperfect self-control, sometimes that men who are practically wise and clever are of imperfect self-control. 7. Again, men are said to be of imperfect self-control, not simply but with the addition of the thing wherein, as in respect of anger, of honor, and gain. These then are pretty well the common statements. Chapter 2. Now a man may raise a question as to the nature of the right conception in violation of which a man fails of self-control. That he can so fail when knowing in the strict sense what is right some say is impossible, for it is a strange thing, as Socrates thought, that while knowledge is present in his mind something else should master him and drag him about like a slave. Socrates in fact contended generally against the theory, maintaining there is no such state as that of imperfect self-control, for that no one acts contrary to what is best conceiving it to be best but by reason of ignorance what is best. With all due respect to Socrates, his account of the matter is at variance with plain facts, and we must inquire with respect to the affection, if it be caused by ignorance what is the nature of the ignorance, for that the man so failing does not suppose his acts to be right before he is under the influence of passion is quite plain. There are people who partly agree with Socrates and partly not, that nothing can be stronger than knowledge they agree, but that no man acts in contravention of his conviction of what is better they do not agree, and so they say that it is not knowledge, but only opinion, which the man in question has and yet yields to the instigation of his pleasures. But then, if it is opinion and not knowledge, that is that the opposing conception be not strong but only mild, as in the case of real doubt, the not abiding by it in the face of strong lusts would be excusable. But wickedness is not excusable, nor is anything which deserves blame. Well then, is it practical wisdom which in this case offers opposition, for that is the strongest principle? The supposition is absurd, for we shall have the same men uniting practical wisdom and imperfect self-control, and surely no single person would maintain that it is consistent with the character of practical wisdom to do voluntarily what is very wrong. And besides we have shown before that the very mark of a man of this character is aptitude to act, as distinguished from mere knowledge of what is right. Because he is a man conversant with particular details, and possessed of all the other virtues. Again, if the having strong and bad lusts is necessary to the idea of the man of self-control, this character cannot be identical with the man of perfected self-mastery, because the having strong desires or bad ones does not enter into the idea of this latter character, and yet the man of self-control must have such, for suppose them good. Then the moral state which should hinder a man from following their suggestions must be bad, and so self-control would not be in all cases good, suppose them. On the other hand, to be weak and not wrong, it would be nothing grand, nor anything great, supposing them to be wrong and weak. Again, if self-control makes a man apt to abide by all opinions without exception, it may be bad, as suppose the case of a false opinion. And if imperfect self-control makes a man apt to depart from all without exception, we shall have cases where it will be good. Take that of Neoptolemus in the Philoctetes of Sophocles, for instance. He is to be praised for not abiding by what he was persuaded to by Ulysses, because he was pained at being guilty of falsehood. Or again, false sophistical reasoning presents a difficulty. For because men wish to prove paradoxes that they may be counted clever when they succeed, the reasoning that has been used becomes a difficulty. For the intellect is fettered, a man being unwilling to abide by the conclusion because it does not please his judgment, but unable to advance because he cannot disentangle the web of sophistical reasoning. Or again, it is conceivable on this supposition that folly joined with imperfect self-control may turn out, in a given case, goodness. For by reason of his imperfection of self-control a man acts in a way which contradicts his notions. Now his notion is that what is really good is bad and ought not to be done, and so he will eventually do what is good and not what is bad. Again, on the same supposition, the man who acting on conviction pursues and chooses things because they are pleasant must be thought a better man than he who does so not by reason of a quasi-rational conviction but of imperfect self-control, because he is more open to cure by reason of the possibility of his receiving a contrary conviction. But to the man of imperfect self-control would apply the proverb, "When water chokes, what should a man drink then?" For had he never been convinced at all in respect of what he does, then by a conviction in a contrary direction he might have stopped in his course. But now though he has had convictions he notwithstanding acts against them. Again, if any and everything is the object matter of imperfect and perfect self-control, who is the man of imperfect self-control simply? Because no one unites all cases of it, and we commonly say that some men are so simply, not adding any particular thing in which they are so. Well, the difficulties raised are pretty near such as I have described them, and of these theories we must remove some and leave others as established, because the solving of a difficulty is a positive act of establishing something as true. Chapter 3. Now we must examine first whether men of imperfect self-control act with a knowledge of what is right or not, next, if with such knowledge, in what sense, and next what are we to assume is the object matter of the man of imperfect self-control, and of the man of self-control. I mean, whether pleasure and pain of all kinds or certain definite ones, and as to self-control and endurance, whether these are designations of the same character or different. And in like manner we must go into all questions which are connected with the present. But the real starting point of the inquiry is, whether the two characters of self-control and imperfect self-control are distinguished by their object matter, or their respective relations to it. I mean, whether the man of imperfect self-control is such simply by virtue of having such and such object matter, or not, but by virtue of his being related to it in such and such a way, or by virtue of both. Next, whether self-control and imperfect self-control are unlimited in their object matter, because he who is designated without any addition a man of imperfect self-control is not unlimited in his object matter, but has exactly the same as the man who has lost all self-control, nor is he so designated because of his relation to this object matter merely, for then his character would be identical with that just mentioned, loss of all self-control, but because of his relation to it being such and such. For the man who has lost all self-control is led on with deliberate moral choice, holding that it is his line to pursue pleasure as it rises, while the man of imperfect self-control does not think that he ought to pursue it, but does pursue it all the same. Now as to the notion that it is true opinion and not knowledge in contravention of which men fail in self-control, it makes no difference to the point in question, because some of those who hold opinions have no doubt about them but suppose themselves to have accurate knowledge. If then it is urged that men holding opinions will be more likely than men who have knowledge to act in contravention of their conceptions, as having but a moderate belief in them, we reply, knowledge will not differ in this respect from opinion, because some men believe their own opinions no less firmly than others do their positive knowledge. Heraclitus is a case in point. Rather, the following is the account of it. The term knowing has two senses. Both the man who does not use his knowledge, and he who does are said to know, there will be a difference between a man's acting wrongly, who though possessed of knowledge does not call it into operation, and his doing so who has it and actually exercises it. The latter is a strange case, but the mere having, if not exercising, presents no anomaly. Again, as there are two kinds of propositions affecting action, universal and particular, there is no reason why a man may not act against his knowledge, having both propositions in his mind, using the universal but not the particular, for the particulars are the objects of moral action. There is a difference also in universal propositions. A universal proposition may relate partly to a man's self and partly to the thing in question. Take the following for instance. Dry food is good for every man. This may have the two minor premises. This is a man, and so is dry food. But whether a given substance is so and so, a man either has not the knowledge or does not exert it. According to these different senses there will be an immense difference, so that for a man to know in the one sense, and yet act wrongly, would be nothing strange, but in any of the other senses it would be a matter for wonder. Again, men may have knowledge in a way different from any of those which have been now stated, for we constantly see a man's state so differing by having and not using knowledge, that he has it in a sense and also has not. When a man is asleep, for instance, or mad, or drunk, well, men under the actual operation of passion are in exactly similar conditions, for anger, lust, and some other such like things manifestly make changes even in the body, and in some they even cause madness. It is plain then that we must say the men of imperfect self-control are in a state similar to these. And their saying what embodies knowledge is no proof of their actually then exercising it, because they who are under the operation of these passions repeat demonstrations, or verses of Empedocles, just as children, when first learning, string words together, but as yet know nothing of their meaning, because they must grow into it, and this is a process requiring time. So that we must suppose these men who fail in self-control to say these moral sayings just as actors do. Furthermore, a man may look at the account of the phenomenon in the following way. From an examination of the actual working of the mind, all action may be analyzed into a syllogism, in which the one premise is an universal maxim and the other concerns particulars of which sense, moral or physical, as the case may be, is cognizant. Now when one results from these two, it follows necessarily that, as far as theory goes, the mind must assert the conclusion, and in practical propositions the man must act accordingly. For instance, let the universal be, all that is sweet should be tasted, the particular, this is sweet. It follows necessarily that he who is able and is not hindered should not only draw, but put in practice, the conclusion this is to be tasted. When then there is in the mind one universal proposition forbidding to taste, and the other all that is sweet is pleasant, with its minor this is sweet, which is the one that really works, and desire happens to be in the man, the first universal bids him avoid this, but the desire leads him on to taste, for it has the power of moving the various organs, and so it results that he fails in self-control, in a certain sense under the influence of reason and opinion not contrary in itself to reason, but only accidentally so, because it is the desire that is contrary to right reason, but not the opinion, and so for this reason brutes are not accounted of imperfect self-control, because they have no power of conceiving universals, but only of receiving and retaining particular impressions. As to the manner in which the ignorance is removed and the man of imperfect self-control recovers his knowledge, the account is the same as with respect to him who is drunk or asleep, and is not peculiar to this affection, so physiologists are the right people to apply to. But whereas the minor premise of every practical syllogism is an opinion on matter cognizable by sense and determines the actions, he who is under the influence of passion either has not this, or so has it that his having does not amount to knowing but merely saying, as a man when drunk might repeat Empedocles' verses, and because the minor term is either universal, nor is thought to have the power of producing knowledge in like manner as the universal term, and so the result which Socrates was seeking comes out, that is to say, the affection does not take place in the presence of that which is thought to be specially and properly knowledge, nor is this dragged about by reason of the affection, but in the presence of that knowledge which is conveyed by sense. Let this account then be accepted of the question respecting the failure in self-control, whether it is with knowledge, and the manner in which such failure is possible or not. though a man possesses knowledge. Chapter 4. The next question to be discussed is whether there is a character to be designated by the term of imperfect self-control, simply, or whether all who are so are to be accounted such, in respect of some particular thing. And if there is such a character, what is his object matter? Now that pleasures and pains are the object matter of men of self-control and of endurance, and also of men of imperfect self-control and softness, is plain. Further, things which produce pleasure are either necessary, or objects of choice in themselves but yet admitting of excess. All bodily things which produce pleasure are necessary, and I call such those which relate to food and other grosser appetites, in short such bodily things as we assumed were the object matter of absence of self-control and of perfected self-mastery. The other class of objects are not necessary, but objects of choice in themselves, I mean, for instance, victory, honor, wealth, and such like good or pleasant things. And those who are excessive in their liking for such things contrary to the principle of right reason which is in their own breasts we do not designate men of imperfect self-control simply, but with the addition of the thing wherein, as in respect of money, or gain, or honor, or anger, and not simply, because we consider them as different characters and only having that title and right of a kind of resemblance. As when we add to a man's name conqueror in the Olympic Games, the account of him, as man differs but little from the account of him as the man who conquered in the Olympic Games, but still it is different. And a proof of the real difference between these so designated with an addition and those simply so called is this, that imperfect self-control is blamed, not as an error merely but also as being a vice, either wholly or partially. But none of these other cases is so blamed. But of those who have for their object matter the bodily enjoyments, which we say are also the object matter of the man of perfected self-mastery and the man who has lost all self-control, he that pursues excessive pleasures and too much avoids things which are painful, as hunger and thirst, heat and cold, and everything connected with touch and taste, not from moral choice but in spite of his moral choice and intellectual conviction, is termed a man of imperfect self-control, not with the addition of any particular object matter as we do in respect of want of control of anger but simply. And a proof that the term is thus applied is that the kindred term, soft, is used in respect of these enjoyments, but not in respect of any of those others. And for this reason we put into the same rank the man of imperfect self-control, the man who has lost it entirely, the man who has it, and the man of perfected self-mastery, but not any of those other characters, because the former have for their object matter the same pleasures and pains. But though they have the same object matter, they are not related to it in the same way, but two of them act upon moral choice, two without it. And so we should say that man is more entirely given up to his passions who pursues excessive pleasures, and avoids moderate pains, being either not at all, or at least but little, urged by desire, than the man who does so because his desire is very strong. Because we think what would the former be likely to do if he had the additional stimulus of youthful lust and violent pain consequent on the want of those pleasures which we have denominated necessary? Well then, since of desires and pleasures there are some which are in kind honorable and good, because things pleasant are divisible, as we said before, into such as are naturally objects of choice, such as are naturally objects of avoidance, and such as are in themselves indifferent, money, gain, honor, victory, for instance, in respect of all such and those that are indifferent. Men are blamed not merely for being affected by or desiring or liking them, but for exceeding in any way in these feelings. And so they are blamed, whosoever in spite of reason are mastered by, that is pursue, any object though in its nature noble and good, they, for instance, who are more earnest than they should be respecting honor, or their children or parents, not but what these are good objects and men are praised for being earnest about them, but still they admit of excess. For instance, if any one, as Niobe did, should fight even against the gods, or feel towards his father as Satyrus, who got there from the nickname of Phiodoamdomicron Pytomegaro, because he was thought to be very foolish. Now depravity there is none in regard of these things, for the reason assigned above, that each of them in itself is a thing naturally choice-worthy, yet the excesses in respect of them are wrong and matter for blame. And similarly there is no imperfect self-control in respect of these things, that being not merely a thing that should be avoided but blameworthy. but because of the resemblance of the affection to the imperfection of self-control, the term is used with the addition in each case of the particular object matter, just as men call a man a bad physician, or bad actor, whom they would not think of calling simply bad. As then in these cases we do not apply the term simply because each of the states is not a vice, but only like a vice in the way of analogy. So it is plain that in respect of imperfect self-control and self-control we must limit the names to those states which have the same object matter as perfected self-mastery and utter loss of self-control, and that we do apply it to the case of anger only in the way of resemblance. For which reason, with an addition, we designate a man of imperfect self-control in respect of anger, as of honor or of gain. Chapter 5. As there are some things naturally pleasant, and of these two kinds, those, namely, which are pleasant generally, and those which are so relatively to particular kinds of animals and men, so there are others which are not naturally pleasant but which come to be so in consequence either of maimings, or custom, or depraved natural tastes, and one may observe moral states similar to those we have been speaking of, having respectively these classes of things for their object matter. I mean the brutish, as in the case of the female who, they say, would rip up women with child and eat the fetus, or the tastes which are found among the savage tribes bordering on the Pontus, some liking raw flesh, and some being cannibals, and some lending one another their children to make feasts of, or what is said of Phalaris. These are instances of brutish states, caused in some by disease or madness. Take, for instance, the man who sacrificed and ate his mother, or him who devoured the liver of his fellow servant. Instances again of those caused by disease or by custom would be plucking out of hair, or eating one's nails, or eating coals and earth. Now wherever nature is really the cause, no one would think of calling men of imperfect self-control, nor, in like manner, such as are in a diseased state through custom. The having any of these inclinations is something foreign to what is denominated vice, just as brutishness is, and when a man has them his mastering them is not properly self-control, nor his being mastered by them imperfection of self-control in the proper sense, but only in the way of resemblance. Just as we may say a man of ungovernable wrath fails of self-control in respect of anger, but not simply fails of self-control. For all excessive folly, cowardice, absence of self-control, or irritability, are either brutish or morbid. The man, for instance, who is naturally afraid of all things, even if a mouse should stir, is cowardly after a brutish sort. There was a man again who, by reason of disease, was afraid of a cat, and of the fools, they who are naturally destitute of reason and live only by sense are brutish, as are some tribes of the far-off barbarians, while others who are so by reason of diseases, epileptic or frantic, are in morbid states. So then, of these inclinations, a man may sometimes merely have one without yielding to it. I mean, suppose that Phalaris had restrained his unnatural desire to eat a child, or he may both have and yield to it. As then vice, when such as belongs to human nature, is called vice simply, while the other is so called with the addition of brutish, or morbid, but not simply vice, so manifestly there is brutish and morbid imperfection of self-control, but that alone is entitled to the name without any qualification, which is of the nature of utter absence of self-control, as it is found in man. Chapter 6. It is plain then that the object matter of imperfect self-control and self-control is restricted to the same as that of utter absence of self-control and that of perfected self-mastery, and that the rest is the object matter of a different species so named metaphorically and not simply. We will now examine the position that imperfect self-control in respect of anger is less disgraceful than that in respect of lusts. In the first place, it seems that anger does in a way listen to reason but mishears it, as quick servants who run out before they have heard the whole of what is said and then mistake the order. Dogs, again, bark at the slightest stir, before they have seen whether it be friend or foe. Just so anger, by reason of its natural heat and quickness, listening to reason, but without having heard the command of reason, rushes to its revenge. That is to say, reason or some impression on the mind shows there is insolence or contempt in the offender, and then anger, reasoning as it were that one ought to fight against what is such, fires up immediately, whereas lust, if reason or sense, as the case may be, merely says a thing is sweet, rushes to the enjoyment of it, and so anger follows reason in a manner, But lust does not and is therefore more disgraceful. Because he that cannot control his anger yields in a manner to reason, but the other to his lust, and not to reason at all. Again, a man is more excusable for following such desires as are natural, just as he is for following such lusts as are common to all and to that degree in which they are common. Now anger and irritability are more natural than lusts when in excess, and for objects not necessary. This was the ground of the defense the man made who beat his father. My father, he said, used to beat his, and his father his again, and this little fellow here, pointing to his child, will beat me when he is grown a man. It runs in the family. And the father, as he was being dragged along, bid his son leave off beating him at the door, because he had himself been used to drag his father so far and no farther. Again, characters are less unjust in proportion as they involve less insidiousness. Now the angry man is not insidious, nor is anger, but quite open, but lust is, as they say of Venus, Cyprus-born goddess, weaver of deceits, or Homer of the girdle called the cestus. Persuasiveness cheating e'en the subtlest mind. And so since this kind of imperfect self-control is more unjust, it is also more disgraceful than that in respect of anger, and is simply imperfect self-control, and vice in a certain sense. Again, no man feels pain in being insolent, but every one who acts through anger does act with pain, and he who acts insolently does it with pleasure. If then those things are most unjust with which we have most right to be angry, then imperfect self-control, arising from lust, is more so than that arising from anger, because in anger there is no insolence. Well then, it is clear that imperfect self-control in respect of lusts is more disgraceful than that in respect of anger, and that the object matter of self-control, and the imperfection of it, are bodily lusts and pleasures. But of these last we must take into account the differences, for, as was said at the commencement, some are proper to the human race and natural both in kind and degree, others brutish, and others caused by maimings and diseases. Now the first of these only are the object matter of perfected self-mastery and utter absence of self-control, and therefore we never attribute either of these states to brutes, except metaphorically, and whenever any one kind of animal differs entirely from another in insolence, mischievousness, or voracity, because they have not moral choice or process of deliberation, but are quite different from that kind of creature just as are madmen from other men. Brutishness is not so low in the scale as vice, yet it is to be regarded with more fear, because it is not that the highest principle has been corrupted, as in the human creature, but the subject has it not at all. It is much the same, therefore, as if one should compare an inanimate with an animate being, which were the worse, for the badness of that which has no principle of origination is always less harmful. Now intellect is a principle of origination. A similar case would be the comparing injustice and an unjust man together, for in different ways each is the worst. A bad man would produce 10,000 times as much harm as a bad brute. Chapter 7. Now with respect to the pleasures and pains which come to a man through touch and taste, and the desiring or avoiding such, which we determined before to constitute the object matter of the states of utter absence of self-control and perfected self-mastery, one may be so disposed as to yield to temptations to which most men would be superior, or to be superior to those to which most men would yield, in respect of pleasures. These characters will be respectively the man of imperfect self-control, and the man of self-control, and in respect of pains, the man of softness and the man of endurance. But the moral state of most men is something between the two, even though they lean somewhat to the worse characters. Again, since of the pleasures indicated some are necessary and some are not, others are so to a certain degree but not the excess or defect of them, and similarly also of lusts and pains, the man who pursues the excess of pleasant things, or such as are in themselves excess, or from moral choice, for their own sake, and not for anything else which is to result from them, is a man utterly void of self-control. For he must be incapable of remorse, and so incurable, because he that has not remorse is incurable. He that has too little love of pleasure is the opposite character, and the man of perfected self-mastery the mean character. He is of a similar character who avoids the bodily pains, not because he cannot, but because he chooses not to withstand them. But of the characters who go wrong without choosing so to do, the one is led on by reason of pleasure, the other because he avoids the pain it would cost him to deny his lust, and so they are different the one from the other. Now every one would pronounce a man worse for doing something base without any impulse of desire, or with a very slight one, than for doing the same from the impulse of a very strong desire. For striking a man when not angry than if he did so in wrath, because one naturally says, what would he have done had he been under the influence of passion? And on this ground, by the by, the man utterly void of self-control is worse than he who has it imperfectly. However, of the two characters which have been mentioned, as included in that of utter absence of self-control, the one is rather softness, the other properly the man of no self-control. Furthermore, to the character of imperfect self-control is opposed that of self-control, and to that of softness that of endurance, because endurance consists in continued resistance but self-control in actual mastery, and continued resistance and actual mastery are as different as not being conquered is from conquering, and so self-control is more choice-worthy than endurance. Again, he who fails when exposed to those temptations against which the common run of men hold out, and are well able to do so, is soft and luxurious. Luxury being a kind of softness, the kind of man, I mean, to let his robe drag in the dirt to avoid the trouble of lifting it, and who, aping the sick man, does not however suppose himself wretched though he is like a wretched man. So it is too with respect to self-control and the imperfection of it. If a man yields to pleasures or pains which are violent and excessive, it is no matter for wonder, but rather for allowance if he made what resistance he could. Instances are Philoctetes in Theodectes' drama when wounded by the viper, or Circean in the elope of Carcinus. Or men who in trying to suppress laughter burst into a loud continuous fit of it, as happened, you remember, to Xenophantus, but it is a matter for wonder. When a man yields to and cannot contend against those pleasures or pains which the common herd are able to resist, always supposing his failure not to be owing to natural constitution or disease, I mean, as the Scythian kings are constitutionally soft, or the natural difference between the sexes. Again, the man who is a slave to amusement is commonly thought to be destitute of self-control, but he really is soft, because amusement is an act of relaxing, being an act of resting, and the character in question is one of those who exceed due bounds in respect of this. Moreover, of imperfect self-control there are two forms, precipitancy and weakness. Those who have it in the latter form, though they have made resolutions, do not abide by them by reason of passion. The others are led by passion because they have never formed any resolutions at all, while there are some who, like those who by tickling themselves beforehand get rid of ticklishness, having felt and seen beforehand the approach of temptation, and roused up themselves in their resolution, yield not to passion, whether the temptation be somewhat pleasant or somewhat painful. The precipitate form of imperfect self-control they are most liable to who are constitutionally of a sharp or melancholy temperament, because the one by reason of the swiftness, the other by reason of the violence, of their passions, do not wait for reason, because they are disposed to follow whatever notion is impressed upon their minds. Again, the man utterly destitute of self-control, as was observed before, is not given to remorse, for it is part of his character that he abides by his moral choice, but the man of imperfect self-control is almost made up of remorse, and so the case is not as we determined it before, but the former is incurable and the latter may be cured, for depravity is like chronic diseases, dropsy and consumption for instance, but imperfect self-control is like acute disorders, the former being a continuous evil, the latter not so. And in fact, imperfect self-control and confirmed vice are different in kind, the latter being imperceptible to its victim, the former not so. But, of the different forms of imperfect self-control, those are better who are carried off their feet by a sudden access of temptation than they who have reason but do not abide by it, these last being overcome by passion less in degree, and not wholly without premeditation as are the others. For the man of imperfect self-control is like those who are soon intoxicated and by little wine and less than the common run of men. Well then, that imperfection of self-control is not confirmed viciousness is plain, and yet perhaps it is such in a way, because in one sense it is contrary to moral choice and in another the result of it. At all events, in respect of the actions, the case is much like what Demodocus said of the Miletians. The people of Miletus are not fools. but they do just the kind of things that fools do, and so they of imperfect self-control are not unjust, but they do unjust acts. But to resume, since the man of imperfect self-control is of such a character as to follow bodily pleasures in excess and in defiance of right reason, without acting on any deliberate conviction, whereas the man utterly destitute of self-control does act upon a conviction which rests on his natural inclination to follow after these pleasures, the former may be easily persuaded to a different course, but the latter not. For virtue and vice respectively preserve and corrupt the moral principle. Now the motive is the principle or starting point in moral actions, just as axioms and postulates are in mathematics, and neither in morals nor mathematics is it reason which is apt to teach the principle, but excellence, either natural or acquired by custom, in holding right notions with respect to the principle. He who does this in morals is the man of perfected self-mastery, and the contrary character is the man utterly destitute of self-control. Again, there is a character liable to be taken off his feet in defiance of right reason because of passion, whom passion so far masters as to prevent his acting in accordance with right reason, but not so far as to make him be convinced that it is his proper line to follow after such pleasures without limit. This character is the man of imperfect self-control, better than he who is utterly destitute of it. And not a bad man simply and without qualification, because in him the highest and best part, i.e. principle, is preserved, and there is another character opposed to him who is apt to abide by his resolutions, and not to depart from them, at all events, not at the instigation of passion. It is evident then from all this, that self-control is a good state, and the imperfection of it a bad one. Chapter 8. Next comes the question, whether a man is a man of self-control for abiding by his conclusions and moral choice be they of what kind they may, or only by the right one, or again, a man of imperfect self-control for not abiding by his conclusions and moral choice be they of whatever kind, or, to put the case we did before, is he such for not abiding by false conclusions and wrong moral choice? Is not this the truth, that incidentally it is by conclusions and moral choice of any kind that the one character abides and the other does not, but per se true conclusions and right moral choice? To explain what is meant by incidentally, and per se, suppose a man chooses or pursues this thing for the sake of that, he is said to pursue and choose that per se, but this only incidentally. For the term per se we use commonly the word simply, and so, in a way, it is opinion of any kind soever by which the two characters respectively abide or not, but he is, simply, entitled to the designations who abides or not by the true opinion. There are also people who have a trick of abiding by their own opinions, who are commonly called positive, as they who are hard to be persuaded, and whose convictions are not easily changed. Now these people bear some resemblance to the character of self-control, just as the prodigal to the liberal, or the rash man to the brave, but they are different in many points. The man of self-control does not change by reason of passion and lust, yet when occasion so requires he will be easy of persuasion. But the positive man changes not at the call of reason, though many of this class take up certain desires and are led by their pleasures. Among the class of positive are the opinionated, the ignorant, and the bearish. The first, from the motives of pleasure and pain. I mean, they have the pleasurable feeling of a kind of victory in not having their convictions changed, and they are pained when their decrees, so to speak, are reversed, so that, in fact, they rather resemble the man of imperfect self-control than the man of self-control. Again, there are some who depart from their resolutions not by reason of any imperfection of self-control. Take, for instance, Neoptolemus in the Philoctetes of Sophocles. Here certainly pleasure was the motive of his departure from his resolution, but then it was one of a noble sort, for to be truthful was noble in his eyes and he had been persuaded by Ulysses to lie. So it is not every one who acts from the motive of pleasure who is utterly destitute of self-control or base or of imperfect self-control, only he who acts from the impulse of a base pleasure. Chapter 9. Moreover, as there is a character who takes less pleasure than he ought in bodily enjoyments, and he also fails to abide by the conclusion of his reason, the man of self-control is the mean between him and the man of imperfect self-control, that is to say, the latter fails to abide by them because of somewhat too much, the former because of somewhat too little, while the man of self-control abides by them. and never changes by reason of anything else than such conclusions. Now, of course, since self-control is good, both the contrary states must be bad, as indeed they plainly are. But because the one of them is seen in few persons, and but rarely in them, self-control comes to be viewed as if opposed only to the imperfection of it, just as perfected self-mastery is thought to be opposed only to utter want of self-control. Again, as many terms are used in the way of similitude, so people have come to talk of the self-control of the man of perfected self-mastery in the way of similitude, for the man of self-control and the man of perfected self-mastery have this in common, that they do nothing against right reason on the impulse of bodily pleasures, but then the former has bad desires, the latter not. And the latter is so constituted as not even to feel pleasure contrary to his reason, the former feels but does not yield to it. Like again are the man of imperfect self-control and he who is utterly destitute of it, though in reality distinct, both follow bodily pleasures, but the latter under a notion that it is the proper line for him to take, his former without any such notion. And it is not possible for the same man to be at once a man of practical wisdom and of imperfect self-control, because the character of practical wisdom includes, as we showed before, goodness of moral character. And again, it is not knowledge merely, but aptitude for action, which constitutes practical wisdom, and of this aptitude the man of imperfect self-control is destitute. But there is no reason why the clever man should not be of imperfect self-control, and the reason why some men are occasionally thought to be men of practical wisdom, and yet of imperfect self-control, is this, that cleverness differs from practical wisdom in the way I stated in a former book, and is very near it so far as the intellectual element is concerned, but differs in respect of the moral choice. Nor is the man of imperfect self-control like the man who both has and calls into exercise his knowledge, but like the man who, having it, is overpowered by sleep or wine. Again, he acts voluntarily, because he knows, in a certain sense, what he does and the result of it, but he is not a confirmed bad man, for his moral choice is good, so he is at all events only half bad. Nor is he unjust, because he does not act with deliberate intent, for of the two chief forms of the character, the one is not apt to abide by his deliberate resolutions, and the other, the man of constitutional strength of passion, is not apt to deliberate at all. So in fact the man of imperfect self-control is like a community which makes all proper enactments, and has admirable laws, only does not act on them, verifying the scoff of Anaxandrides. That state did will it, which cares not for laws. Whereas the bad man is like one which acts upon its laws, but then unfortunately they are bad ones. Imperfection of self-control and self-control, after all, are above the average state of men, because he of the latter character is more true to his reason, and the former less so, than is in the power of most men. Again, of the two forms of imperfect self-control that is more easily cured which they have who are constitutionally of strong passions, than that of those who form resolutions and break them, and they that are so through habituation than they that are so naturally, since of course custom is easier to change than nature, because the very resemblance of custom to nature is what constitutes the difficulty of changing it, as Evenus says. Practice, I say, my friend, doth long endure. And at the last is even very nature. We have now said then what self-control is, what imperfection of self-control, what endurance, and what softness, and how these states are mutually related. Book 8. Chapter 1. Next would seem properly to follow a dissertation on friendship, because, in the first place, it is either itself a virtue or connected with virtue, and next it is a thing most necessary for life, since no one would choose to live without friends though he should have all the other good things in the world, and in fact, men who are rich or possessed of authority and influence are thought to have special need of friends. For where is the use of such prosperity if there be taken away the doing of kindnesses of which friends are the most usual and most commendable objects? Or how can it be kept or preserved without friends? Because the greater it is, so much the more slippery and hazardous. In poverty, moreover, and all other adversities, men think friends to be their only refuge. Furthermore, friendship helps the young to keep from error, the old, in respect of attention and such deficiencies in action as their weakness makes them liable to, and those who are in their prime, in respect of noble deeds. They two together going, Homer says, you may remember, because they are thus more able to devise plans and carry them out. Again, it seems to be implanted in us by nature, as, for instance, in the parent towards the offspring and the offspring towards the parent, not merely in the human species, but likewise in birds and most animals, and in those of the same tribe towards one another, and specially in men of the same nation, for which reason we commend those men who love their fellows. And one may see in the course of travel how close of kin and how friendly man is to man. Furthermore, friendship seems to be the bond of social communities, and legislators seem to be more anxious to secure it than justice even. I mean, unanimity is somewhat like to friendship, and this they certainly aim at and specially drive out faction as being inimical. Again, where people are in friendship, justice is not required. But on the other hand, though they are just, they need friendship in addition, and that principle which is most truly just is thought to partake of the nature of friendship. Lastly, not only is it a thing necessary but honorable likewise, since we praise those who are fond of friends, and the having numerous friends is thought a matter of credit to a man. Some go so far as to hold that good man and friend are terms synonymous. Chapter 2. Yet the disputed points respecting it are not few. Some men lay down that it is a kind of resemblance, and that men who are like one another are friends, whence come the common sayings, like wool to like, birds of a feather, and so on. Others, on the contrary, say that all such come under the maxim, two of a trade never agree. Again, some men push their inquiries on these points higher and reason physically, as Euripides, who says, the earth by drought consumed doth love the rain, and the great heaven, overcharged with rain, doth love to fall in showers upon the earth. Heraclitus, again, maintains that contrariety is expedient, and that the best agreement arises from things differing, and that all things come into being in the way of the principle of antagonism. Empedocles, among others, in direct opposition to these, affirms that like aims at like. These physical questions we will take leave to omit, inasmuch as they are foreign to the present inquirer, and we will examine such as are proper to man and concern moral characters and feelings, as, for instance, does friendship arise among all without distinction, or is it impossible for bad men to be friends? And, is there but one species of friendship, or several? For they who ground the opinion that there is but one on the fact that friendship admits of degrees hold that upon insufficient proof, because things which are different in species admit likewise of degrees. On this point we have spoken before. Chapter 3. Our view will soon be cleared on these points when we have ascertained what is properly the object matter of friendship, for it is thought that not everything indiscriminately, but some peculiar matter alone, is the object of this affection, that is to say, what is good, or pleasurable, or useful. Now it would seem that that is useful through which accrues any good or pleasure, and so the objects of friendship, as absolute ends, are the good and the pleasurable. A question here arises, whether it is good absolutely or that which is good to the individuals, for which men feel friendship, these two being sometimes distinct and similarly in respect of the pleasurable. It seems then that each individual feels it towards that which is good to himself, and that abstractedly it is the real good which is the object of friendship, and to each individual that which is good to each. It comes then to this, that each individual feels friendship not for what is but for that which conveys to his mind the impression of being good to himself. But this will make no real difference, because that which is truly the object of friendship will also convey this impression to the mind. There are then three causes from which men feel friendship, but the term is not applied to the case of fondness for things inanimate because there is no requital of the affection nor desire for the good of those objects. It certainly savors of the ridiculous to say that a man fond of wine wishes well to it, the only sense in which it is true being that he wishes it to be kept safe and sound for his own use and benefit. But to the friend they say one should wish all good for his sake. And when men do thus wish good to another, he not reciprocating the feeling, people call them kindly, because friendship they describe as being kindliness between persons who reciprocate it. But must they not add that the feeling must be mutually known? For many men are kindly disposed towards those whom they have never seen but whom they conceive to be amiable or useful, and this notion amounts to the same thing as a real feeling between them. Well, these are plainly kindly disposed towards one another. But how can one call them friends while their mutual feelings are unknown to one another? To complete the idea of friendship, then, it is requisite that they have kindly feelings towards one another, and wish one another good from one of the aforementioned causes, and that these kindly feelings should be mutually known. Chapter 4. As the motives to friendship differ in kind, so do the respective feelings and friendships. The species then of friendship are three, in number equal to the objects of it, since in the line of each there may be mutual affection mutually known. Now they who have friendship for one another desire one another's good according to the motive of their friendship. Accordingly, they whose motive is utility have no friendship for one another really, but only in so far as some good arises to them from one another. And they whose motive is pleasure are in like case. I mean, they have friendship for men of easy pleasantry, not because they are of a given character but because they are pleasant to themselves. So then they whose motive to friendship is utility love their friends for what is good to themselves. They whose motive is pleasure do so for what is pleasurable to themselves. That is to say, not in so far as the friend beloved is, but in so far as he is useful or pleasurable. These friendships then are a matter of result, since the object is not beloved in that he is the man he is, but in that he furnishes advantage or pleasure, as the case may be. Such friendships are of course very liable to dissolution if the parties do not continue alike. I mean, that the others cease to have any friendship for them when they are no longer pleasurable or useful. Now it is the nature of utility not to be permanent but constantly varying. So, of course, when the motive which made them friends is vanished, the friendship likewise dissolves, since it existed only relatively to those circumstances. Friendship of this kind is thought to exist principally among the old, because men at that time of life pursue not what is pleasurable but what is profitable, and in such, of men in their prime and of the young, as are given to the pursuit of profit. They that are such have no intimate intercourse with one another, for sometimes they are not even pleasurable to one another, nor, in fact, do they desire such intercourse unless their friends are profitable to them, because they are pleasurable only in so far as they have hopes of advantage. With these friendships is commonly ranked that of hospitality. But the friendship of the young is thought to be based on the motive of pleasure, because they live at the beck and call of passion and generally pursue what is pleasurable to themselves and the object of the present moment, and as their age changes so likewise do their pleasures. This is the reason why they form and dissolve friendships rapidly, since the friendship changes with the pleasurable object and such pleasure changes quickly. The young are also much given up to love, this passion being, in great measure, a matter of impulse and based on pleasure, for which cause they conceive friendships and quickly drop them, changing often in the same day. But these wish for society and intimate intercourse with their friends, since they thus attain the object of their friendship. Chapter 5. That then is perfect friendship which subsists between those who are good and whose similarity consists in their goodness. For these men wish one another's good in similar ways, in so far as they are good, and good they are in themselves. And those are specially friends who wish good to their friends for their sakes, because they feel thus towards them on their own account and not as a mere matter of result. So the friendship between these men continues to subsist so long as they are good. And goodness, we know, has in it a principle of permanence. Moreover, each party is good abstractedly, and also relatively to his friend, for all good men are not only abstractedly good but also useful to one another. Such friends are also mutually pleasurable because all good men are so abstractedly, and also relatively to one another, inasmuch as to each individual those actions are pleasurable which correspond to his nature, and all such as are like them. Now when men are good these will be always the same, or at least similar. Friendship then under these circumstances is permanent, as we should reasonably expect, since it combines in itself all the requisite qualifications of friends. I mean, that friendship of whatever kind is based upon good or pleasure, either abstractedly or relatively to the person entertaining the sentiment of friendship, and results from a similarity of some sort, and to this kind belong all the aforementioned requisites in the parties themselves, because in this the parties are similar, and so on. Moreover, in it there is the abstractedly good and the abstractedly pleasant. And as these are specially the object matter of friendship, so the feeling and the state of friendship is found most intense, and most excellent in men thus qualified. Rare it is probable friendships of this kind will be, because men of this kind are rare. Besides all requisite qualifications being presupposed, there is further required time and intimacy, for, as the proverb says, men cannot know one another till they have eaten the requisite quantity of salt together. Nor can they in fact admit one another to intimacy, much less be friends, till each has appeared to the other and been proved to be a fit object of friendship. They who speedily commence an interchange of friendly actions may be said to wish to be friends, but they are not so unless they are also proper objects of friendship and mutually known to be such. That is to say, a desire for friendship may arise quickly but not friendship itself. Well, this friendship is perfect both in respect of the time and in all other points, and exactly the same and similar results accrue to each party from the other, which ought to be the case between friends. The friendship based upon the pleasurable is, so to say, a copy of this, since the good are sources of pleasure to one another, and that based on utility likewise, the good being also useful to one another. Between men thus connected friendships are most permanent when the same result accrues to both from one another, pleasure, for instance, and not merely so but from the same source, as in the case of two men of easy pleasantry, and not as it is in that of a lover and the object of his affection, these not deriving their pleasure from the same causes, but the former from seeing the latter and the latter from receiving the attentions of the former, and when the bloom of youth fades the friendship sometimes ceases also, because then the lover derives no pleasure from seeing and the object of his affection ceases to receive the attentions which were paid before. In many cases, however, people so connected continue friends, if being of similar tempers they have come from custom to like one another's disposition. Where people do not interchange pleasure but profit in matters of love, the friendship is both less intense in degree and also less permanent. In fact, they who are friends because of advantage commonly part when the advantage ceases, for, in reality, they never were friends of one another but of the advantage. So then it appears that from motives of pleasure or profit bad men may be friends to one another, or good men to bad men or men of neutral character to one of any character whatever, but disinterestedly, for the sake of one another. Plainly the good alone can be friends, because bad men have no pleasure even in themselves unless in so far as some advantage arises. And further, the friendship of the good is alone superior to calumny, it not being easy for men to believe a third person respecting one whom they have long tried and proved. There is between good men mutual confidence, and the feeling that one's friend would never have done one wrong, and all other such things as are expected in friendship really worthy the name. But in the other kinds there is nothing to prevent all such suspicions. I call them friendships, because since men commonly give the name of friends to those who are connected from motives of profit, which is justified by political language, for alliances between states are thought to be contracted with a view to advantage, and to those who are attached to one another by the motive of pleasure, as children are, we may perhaps also be allowed to call such persons friends, and say there are several species of friendship, primarily and specially that of the good, in that they are good, and the rest only in the way of resemblance. I mean, people connected otherwise are friends in that way in which there arises to them somewhat good and some mutual resemblance, because we must remember the pleasurable is good to those who are fond of it. These secondary friendships, however, do not combine very well. That is to say, the same persons do not become friends by reason of advantage and by reason of the pleasurable, for these matters of result are not often combined. And friendship having been divided into these kinds, bad men will be friends by reason of pleasure or profit, this being their point of resemblance, while the good are friends for one another's sake, that is, in so far as they are good. These last may be termed abstractedly and simply friends, the former as a matter of result and termed friends from their resemblance to these last. Chapter 6. Further, just as in respect of the different virtues some men are termed good in respect of a certain inward state, others in respect of acts of working, so is it in respect of friendship. I mean, they who live together take pleasure in, and impart good to, one another. But they who are asleep or are locally separated do not perform acts, but only are in such a state as to act in a friendly way if they acted at all. Distance has in itself no direct effect upon friendship, but only prevents the acting it out. Yet if the absence be protracted, It is thought to cause a forgetfulness even of the friendship, and hence it has been said, "Many and many a friendship doth want of intercourse destroy." Accordingly, neither the old nor the morose appear to be calculated for friendship, because the pleasurableness in them is small, and no one can spend his days in company with that which is positively painful, or even not pleasurable, since to avoid the painful and aim at the pleasurable is one of the most obvious tendencies of human nature. They who get on with one another very fairly, but are not in habits of intimacy, are rather like people having kindly feelings towards one another than friends, nothing being so characteristic of friends as the living with one another, because the necessitous desire assistance, and the happy companionship, they being the last persons in the world for solitary existence. But people cannot spend their time together unless they are mutually pleasurable and take pleasure in the same objects, a quality which is thought to appertain to the friendship of companionship. Chapter 7. The connection then subsisting between the good is friendship par excellence, as has already been frequently said, since that which is abstractedly good or pleasant is thought to be an object of friendship and choice worthy, and to each individual whatever is such to him, and the good man to the good man for both these reasons. Now the entertaining the sentiment is like a feeling, but friendship itself like a state, because the former may have for its object even things inanimate, but requital of friendship is attended with moral choice which proceeds from a moral state, and again, men wish good to the objects of their friendship for their sakes, not in the way of a mere feeling but of moral state. And the good, in loving their friend, love their own good, inasmuch as the good man, when brought into that relation, becomes a good to him with whom he is so connected, so that either party loves his own good, and repays his friend equally both in wishing well and in the pleasurable, for equality is said to be a tie of friendship. Well, these points belong most to the friendship between good men. But between morose or elderly men friendship is less apt to arise, because they are somewhat awkward-tempered, and take less pleasure in intercourse and society, these being thought to be specially friendly and productive of friendship. And so young men become friends quickly, old men not so, because people do not become friends with any, unless they take pleasure in them, and in like manner neither do the morose. Yet men of these classes entertain kindly feelings towards one another. They wish good to one another and render mutual assistance in respect of their needs, but they are not quite friends, because they either spend their time together nor take pleasure in one another, which circumstances are thought specially to belong to friendship. To be a friend to many people, in the way of the perfect friendship, is not possible. Just as you cannot be in love with many at once, it is, so to speak, a state of excess which naturally has but one object. And besides, it is not an easy thing for one man to be very much pleased with many people at the same time, nor perhaps to find many really good. Again, a man needs experience, and to be in habits of close intimacy, which is very difficult. But it is possible to please many on the score of advantage and pleasure, because there are many men of the kind, and the services may be rendered in a very short time. Of the two imperfect kinds, that which most resembles the perfect is the friendship based upon pleasure, in which the same results accrue from both and they take pleasure in one another or in the same objects, such as are the friendships of the young, because a generous spirit is most found in these. The friendship because of advantage is the connecting link of shopkeepers. Then again, the very happy have no need of persons who are profitable, but of pleasant ones they have because they wish to have people to live intimately with, and what is painful they bear for a short time indeed, but continuously no one could support it, nay, not even the chief good itself, if it were painful to him individually, and so they look out for pleasant friends. Perhaps they ought to require such to be good also, and good moreover to themselves individually, because then they will have all the proper requisites of friendship. Men in power are often seen to make use of several distinct friends, for some are useful to them and others pleasurable, but the two are not often united, because they do not, in fact, seek such as shall combine pleasantness and goodness, nor such as shall be useful for honorable purposes, but with a view to attain what is pleasant they look out for men of easy pleasantry, and again, for men who are clever at executing any business put into their hands, and these qualifications are not commonly found united in the same man. It has been already stated that the good man unites the qualities of pleasantness and usefulness, But then such a one will not be a friend to a superior unless he be also his superior in goodness. For if this be not the case, he cannot, being surpassed in one point, make things equal by a proportionate degree of friendship. And characters who unite superiority of station and goodness are not common. Chapter 8. Now all the kinds of friendship which have been already mentioned exist in a state of equality, inasmuch as either the same results accrue to both and they wish the same things to one another, or else they barter one thing against another. Pleasure, for instance, against profit. It has been said already that friendships of this latter kind are less intense in degree and less permanent. And it is their resemblance or dissimilarity to the same thing which makes them to be thought to be and not to be friendships. They show like friendships in right of their likeness to that which is based on virtue, the one kind having the pleasurable, the other the profitable, both of which belong also to the other. And again, they do not show like friendships by reason of their unlikeness to that true kind, which unlikeness consists herein, that while that is above calumny, and so permanent, these quickly change and differ in many other points. But there is another form of friendship, that, namely, in which the one party is superior to the other, as between father and son, elder and younger, husband and wife, ruler and ruled. These also differ one from another. I mean, the friendship between parents and children is not the same as between ruler and the ruled, nor has the father the same towards the son as the son towards the father, nor the husband towards the wife as she towards him, because the work, and therefore the excellence, of each of these is different, and different therefore are the causes of their feeling friendship. Distinct and different therefore are their feelings and states of friendship. And the same results do not accrue to each from the other, nor in fact ought they to be looked for. But when children render to their parents what they ought to the authors of their being, and parents to their sons what they ought to their offspring, the friendship between such parties will be permanent and equitable. Further, the feeling of friendship should be in a due proportion in all friendships which are between superior and inferior. I mean, the better man, or the more profitable, and so forth, should be the object of a stronger feeling than he himself entertains, because when the feeling of friendship comes to be after a certain rate, then equality in a certain sense is produced, which is thought to be a requisite in friendship. It must be remembered, however, that the equal is not in the same case as regards justice and friendship. For in strict justice the exactly proportioned equal ranks first, and the actual numerically equal ranks second, while in friendship this is exactly reversed. And that equality is thus requisite is plainly shown by the occurrence of a great difference of goodness or badness, or prosperity, or something else. For in this case, people are not any longer friends, nay, they do not even feel that they ought to be. The clearest illustration is perhaps the case of the gods, because they are most superior in all good things. It is obvious, too, in the case of kings, for they who are greatly their inferiors do not feel entitled to be friends to them, nor do people very insignificant to be friends to those of very high excellence, or wisdom. Of course, in such cases it is out of the question to attempt to define up to what point they may continue friends, for you may remove many points of agreement and the friendship lasts nevertheless. But when one of the parties is very far separated, as a god from men, it cannot continue any longer. This has given room for a doubt, whether friends do really wish to their friends the very highest goods, as that they may be gods, because, in case the wish were accomplished, they would no longer have them for friends, nor in fact would they have the good things they had, because friends are good things. If then it has been rightly said that a friend wishes to his friend good things for that friend's sake, it must be understood that he is to remain such as he now is. That is to say, he will wish the greatest good to him of which as man he is capable, yet perhaps not all, because each man desires good for himself most of all. It is thought that desire for honor makes the mass of men wish rather to be the objects of the feeling of friendship than to entertain it themselves, and for this reason they are fond of flatterers, a flatterer being a friend inferior or at least pretending to be such, and rather to entertain towards another the feeling of friendship than to be himself the object of it, since the former is thought to be nearly the same as being honored, which the mass of men desire. And yet men seem to choose honor, not for its own sake, but incidentally. I mean, the common run of men delight to be honored by those in power because of the hope it raises, that is, they think they shall get from them anything they may happen to be in want of, so they delight in honor as an earnest of future benefit. They again who grasp at honor at the hands of the good, and those who are really acquainted with their merits desire to confirm their own opinion about themselves. So they take pleasure in the conviction that they are good, which is based on the sentence of those who assert it. But in being the objects of friendship men delight for its own sake, and so this may be judged to be higher than being honored, and friendship to be in itself choice-worthy. Friendship, moreover, is thought to consist in feeling, rather than being the object of the sentiment of friendship, which is proved by the delight mothers have in the feeling. Some there are who give their children to be adopted and brought up by others, and knowing them bear this feeling towards them, never seeking to have it returned, if both are not possible, but seeming to be content with seeing them well off and bearing this feeling themselves towards them, even though they, by reason of ignorance, never render to them any filial regard or love. Since then friendship stands rather in the entertaining than in being the object of the sentiment, and they are praised who are fond of their friends, it seems that entertaining the sentiment is the excellence of friends. And so, in whomsoever this exists in due proportion, these are stable friends, and their friendship is permanent. And in this way may they who are unequal best be friends, because they may thus be made equal. Equality, then, and similarity are a tie to friendship, and specially the similarity of goodness, because good men, being stable in themselves, are also stable as regards others, and neither ask degrading services nor render them, but, so to say, rather prevent them. For it is the part of the good neither to do wrong themselves nor to allow their friends in so doing. The bad, on the contrary, have no principle of stability. In fact, they do not even continue like themselves, only they come to be friends for a short time from taking delight in one another's wickedness. Those connected by motives of profit or pleasure hold together somewhat longer, so long, that is to say, as they can give pleasure or profit mutually. The friendship based on motives of profit is thought to be most of all formed out of contrary elements. The poor man, for instance, is thus a friend of the rich, and the ignorant of the man of information, that is to say, a man desiring that of which he is, as it happens, in want, gives something else in exchange for it. To this same class we may refer the lover and beloved, the beautiful and the ill-favored. For this reason lovers sometimes show in a ridiculous light by claiming to be the objects of as intense a feeling as they themselves entertain. Of course, if they are equally fit objects of friendship, they are perhaps entitled to claim this. But if they have nothing of the kind, it is ridiculous. Perhaps, moreover, the contrary does not aim at its contrary for its own sake but incidentally. The mean is really what is grasped at, it being good for the dry, for instance, not to become wet but to attain the mean, and so of the hot, etc. However, let us drop these questions, because they are in fact somewhat foreign to our purpose. Chapter 9. It seems too, as was stated at the commencement, that friendship and justice have the same object matter, and subsist between the same persons. I mean that in every communion there is thought to be some principle of justice and also some friendship. Men address as friends, for instance, those who are their comrades by sea, or in war, and in like manner also those who are brought into communion with them in other ways, and the friendship. Because also the justice is coextensive with the communion, this justifies the common proverb. The goods of friends are common, since friendship rests upon communion. Now brothers and intimate companions have all in common, but other people have their property separate, and some have more in common and others less, because the friendships likewise differ in degree. So too do the various principles of justice involved, not being the same between parents and children as between brothers, nor between companions as between fellow citizens merely, and so on of all the other conceivable friendships. Different also are the principles of injustice as regards these different grades, and the acts become intensified by being done to friends. For instance, it is worse to rob your companion than one who is merely a fellow citizen, to refuse help to a brother than to a stranger, and to strike your father than any one else. So then the justice naturally increases with the degree of friendship, as being between the same parties and of equal extent. All cases of communion are parts, so to say, of the great social one, since in them men associate with a view to some advantage and to procure some of those things which are needful for life. And the great social communion is thought originally to have been associated and to continue for the sake of some advantage. this being the point at which legislators aim, affirming that to be just which is generally expedient. All the other cases of communion aim at advantage in particular points. The crew of a vessel at that which is to result from the voyage which is undertaken with a view to making money, or some such object. Comrades in war at that which is to result from the war, grasping either at wealth or victory, or it may be a political position, and those of the same tribe, or demus, in like manner. Some of them are thought to be formed for pleasure's sake, those, for instance, of bacchanals or club fellows, which are with a view to sacrifice or merely company. But all these seem to be ranged under the great social one, inasmuch as the aim of this is, not merely the expediency of the moment but for life and at all times, with a view to which the members of it institute sacrifices and their attendant assemblies, to render honor to the gods and procure for themselves respite from toil combined with pleasure. For it appears that sacrifices and religious assemblies in old times were made as a kind of first fruits after the ingathering of the crops, because at such seasons they had most leisure. So then it appears that all the instances of communion are parts of the great social one, and corresponding friendships will follow upon such communions. Chapter 10. Of political constitutions there are 3 kinds, and equal in number are the deflections from them, being, so to say, corruptions of them. The former are kingship, aristocracy, and that which recognizes the principle of wealth, which it seems appropriate to call timocracy. I give to it the name of a political constitution because people commonly do so. Of these the best is monarchy, and timocracy the worst. From monarchy the deflection is despotism, both being monarchies but widely differing from each other. For the despot looks to his own advantage, but the king to that of his subjects. For he is in fact no king who is not thoroughly independent and superior to the rest in all good things, and he that is this has no further wants. He will not then have to look to his own advantage but to that of his subjects. For he that is not in such a position is a mere king elected by lot for the nonce. But despotism is on a contrary footing to this kingship, because the despot pursues his own good, and in the case of this its inferiority is most evident, and what is worse is contrary to what is best. The transition to despotism is made from kingship, despotism being a corrupt form of monarchy, that is to say, the bad king comes to be a despot. From aristocracy to oligarchy the transition is made by the fault of the rulers in distributing the public property contrary to right proportion, and giving either all that is good, or the greatest share, to themselves, and the offices to the same persons always, making wealth their idol. Thus a few bear rule and they bad men in the place of the best. From timocracy the transition is to democracy, they being contiguous. For it is the nature of timocracy to be in the hands of a multitude, and all in the same grade of property are equal. Democracy is the least vicious of all, since herein the form of the constitution undergoes least change. Well, these are generally the changes to which the various constitutions are liable, being the least in degree and the easiest to make. Likenesses, and, as it were, models of them, one may find even in domestic life. For instance, the communion between a father and his sons presents the figure of kingship, because the children are the father's care, and hence Homer names Jupiter father because kingship is intended to be a paternal rule. Among the Persians, however, the father's rule is despotic, for they treat their sons as slaves. The relation of master to slaves is of the nature of despotism because the point regarded herein is the master's interest. This now strikes me to be as it ought, but the Persian custom to be mistaken, because for different persons there should be different rules. Between husband and wife the relation takes the form of aristocracy, because he rules by right and in such points only as the husband should, and gives to the wife all that befits her to have. Where the husband lords it in everything he changes the relation into an oligarchy, because he does it contrary to right and not as being the better of the two. In some instances the wives take the reins of government, being heiresses. Here the rule is carried on not in right of goodness but by reason of wealth and power, as it is in oligarchies. Timocracy finds its type in the relation of brothers, they being equal except as to such differences as age introduces, for which reason, if they are very different in age, the friendship comes to be no longer a fraternal one, while democracy is represented specially by families which have no head, all being their equal, or in which the proper head is weak and so every member does that which is right, in his own eyes. Chapter 11. Attendant then on each form of political constitution there plainly is friendship exactly coextensive with the principle of justice, that between a king and his subjects being in the relation of a superiority of benefit, inasmuch as he benefits his subjects, it being assumed that he is a good king and takes care of their welfare as a shepherd tends his flock, whence Homer, to quote him again, calls Agamemnon, shepherd of the people. And of this same kind is the paternal friendship, only that it exceeds the former in the greatness of the benefits done, because the father is the author of being, which is esteemed the greatest benefit, and of maintenance and education. These things are also, by the way, ascribed to ancestors generally, and by the law of nature the father has the right of rule over his sons, ancestors over their descendants, and the king over his subjects. These friendships are also between superiors and inferiors, for which reason parents are not merely loved but also honored. The principle of justice also between these parties is not exactly the same but according to proportion, because so also is the friendship. Now between husband and wife there is the same friendship as in aristocracy, for the relation is determined by relative excellence, and the better person has the greater good and each has what befits. So too also is the principle of justice between them. The fraternal friendship is like that of companions, because brothers are equal and much of an age, and such persons have generally like feelings and like dispositions. Like to this also is the friendship of a timocracy, because the citizens are intended to be equal and equitable. Rule, therefore, passes from hand to hand, and is distributed on equal terms. So too is the friendship accordingly. In the deflections from the constitutional forms, just as the principle of justice is but small, so is the friendship also, and least of all in the most perverted form. In despotism there is little or no friendship. For generally wherever the ruler and the ruled have nothing in common there is no friendship because there is no justice. But the case is as between an artisan and his tool, or between soul and body, and master and slave. All these are benefited by those who use them, but towards things inanimate there is neither friendship nor justice, nor even towards a horse or an ox, or a slave qua slave, because there is nothing in common. A slave as such is an animate tool, a tool an inanimate slave. Qua slave, then, there is no friendship towards him, only qua man, for it is thought that there is some principle of justice between every man and every other who can share in law and be a party to an agreement, and so somewhat of friendship, in so far as he is man. So in despotisms the friendships and the principle of justice are inconsiderable in extent, but in democracies they are most considerable because they who are equal have much in common. Chapter 12. Now of course all friendship is based upon communion, as has been already stated, but one would be inclined to separate off from the rest the friendship of kindred, and that of companions, whereas those of men of the same city, or tribe, or crew, and all such, are more peculiarly, it would seem, based upon communion, inasmuch as they plainly exist in right of some agreement expressed or implied. Among these one may rank also the friendship of hospitality. The friendship of kindred is likewise of many kinds, and appears in all its varieties to depend on the parents, love their children as being a part of themselves, children love their parents as being themselves somewhat derived from them. But parents know their offspring more than these know that they are from the parents, and the source is more closely bound to that which is produced than that which is produced is to that which formed it. Of course, whatever is derived from oneself is proper to that from which it is so derived, as, for instance, a tooth or a hair, or any other thing whatever to him that has it, but the source to it is in no degree proper, or in an inferior degree at least. Then again the greater length of time comes in. The parents love their offspring from the first moment of their being, but their offspring them only after a lapse of time when they have attained intelligence or instinct. These considerations serve also to show why mothers have greater strength of affection than fathers. Now parents love their children as themselves, since what is derived from themselves becomes a kind of other self by the fact of separation, but children their parents as being sprung from them. And brothers love one another from being sprung from the same, that is, their sameness with the common stock creates a sameness with one another, whence come the phrases, same blood root, and so on. In fact, they are the same, in a sense, even in the separate distinct individuals. Then again, the being brought up together, and the nearness of age, are a great help towards friendship, for a man likes one of his own age, and persons who are used to one another are companions, which accounts for the resemblance between the friendship of brothers and that of companions. And cousins and all other relatives derive their bond of union from these, that is to say, from their community of origin, and the strength of this bond varies according to their respective distances from the common ancestor. Further, the friendship felt by children towards parents, and by men towards the gods, is as towards something good and above them, because these have conferred the greatest possible benefits, in that they are the causes of their being and being nourished, and of their having been educated after they were brought into being. And friendship of this kind has also the pleasurable and the profitable more than that between persons unconnected by blood, in proportion as their life is also more shared in common. Then again, in the fraternal friendship there is all that there is in that of companions, and more in the good, and generally in those who are alike, in proportion as they are more closely tied and from their very birth have a feeling of affection for one another to begin with, and as they are more alike in disposition who spring from the same stock and have grown up together and been educated alike. And besides this, they have the greatest opportunities in respect of time for proving one another, and can therefore depend most securely upon the trial. Between husband and wife there is thought to be friendship by a law of nature, man being by nature disposed to pair, more than to associate in communities, in proportion as the family is prior in order of time and more absolutely necessary than the community. And procreation is more common to him with other animals. All the other animals have communion thus far, but human creatures cohabit not merely for the sake of procreation but also with a view to life in general, because in this connection the works are immediately divided, and some belong to the man, others to the woman. Thus they help one the other, putting what is peculiar to each into the common stock. And for these reasons this friendship is thought to combine the profitable and the pleasurable. It will be also based upon virtue if they are good people, because each has goodness, and they may take delight in this quality in each other. Children too are thought to be a tie, accordingly the childless sooner separate, for the children are a good common to both, and anything in common is a bond of union. The question how a man is to live with his wife, or, more generally, one friend with another, appears to be no other than this, how it is just that they should, because plainly there is not the same principle of justice between a friend and friend, as between strangers, or companions, or mere chance fellow travelers. Chapter 13. There are then, as was stated at the commencement of this book, 3 kinds of friendship, and in each there may be friends on a footing of equality and friends in the relation of superior and inferior. We find, that people who are alike in goodness become friends, and better with worse, and so also pleasant people, again, because of advantage people are friends, either balancing exactly their mutual profitableness or differing from one another herein. Well then, those who are equal should in right of this equality be equalized also by the degree of their friendship and the other points, and those who are on a footing of inequality by rendering friendship in proportion to the superiority of the other party. Fault-finding and blame arises, either solely or most naturally, in friendship of which utility is the motive, for they who are friends by reason of goodness are eager to do kindnesses to one another because this is a natural result of goodness and friendship. And when men are vying with each other for this end there can be no fault-finding nor contention. Since no one is annoyed at one who entertains for him the sentiment of friendship and does kindnesses to him, but if of a refined mind he requites him with kind actions. And suppose that one of the two exceeds the other, yet as he is attaining his object he will not find fault with his friend, for good is the object of each party. Neither can there well be quarrels between men who are friends for pleasure's sake, because supposing them to delight in living together then both attain their desire. Or if not, a man would be put in a ridiculous light who should find fault with another for not pleasing him, since it is in his power to forbear intercourse with him. But the friendship because of advantage is very liable to fault-finding, because, as the parties use one another with a view to advantage, the requirements are continually enlarging, and they think they have less than of right belongs to them, and find fault because though justly entitled they do not get as much as they want, while they who do the kindnesses can never come up to the requirements of those to whom they are being done. It seems also that as the just is of 2 kinds, the unwritten and the legal, So friendship, because of advantage, is of two kinds, what may be called the moral and the legal. And the most fruitful source of complaints is that parties contract obligations and discharge them not in the same line of friendship. The legal is upon specified conditions, either purely tradesmanlike from hand to hand or somewhat more gentlemanly as regards time, but still by agreement a quid pro quo. In this legal kind the obligation is clear and admits of no dispute. The friendly element is the delay in requiring its discharge, and for this reason in some countries no actions can be maintained at law for the recovery of such debts, it being held that they who have dealt on the footing of credit must be content to abide the issue. That which may be termed the moral kind is not upon specified conditions, but a man gives as to his friend and so on. But still he expects to receive an equivalent, or even more, as though he had not given but lent. He also will find fault, because he does not get the obligation discharged in the same way as it was contracted. Now this results from the fact that all men, or the generality at least, wish what is honorable, but when tested, choose what is profitable, and the doing kindnesses disinterestedly is honorable while receiving benefits is profitable. In such cases one should, if able, make a return proportionate to the good received, and do so willingly, because one ought not to make a disinterested friend of a man against his inclination. One should act, I say, as having made a mistake originally in receiving kindness from one from whom one ought not to have received it, he being not a friend nor doing the act disinterestedly. One should therefore discharge one's self of the obligation as having received a kindness on specified terms, and, if able, a man would engage to repay the kindness, while if he were unable, even the doer of it would not expect it of him, so that if he is able he ought to repay it. But one ought at the first to ascertain from whom one is receiving kindness, and on what understanding, that on that same understanding one may accept it or not. A question admitting of dispute is whether one is to measure a kindness by the good done to the receiver of it, and make this the standard by which to requite, or by the kind intention of the doer? For they who have received kindnesses frequently plead in depreciation that they have received from their benefactors such things as were small for them to give, or such as they themselves could have got from others, while the doers of the kindnesses affirm that they gave the best they had, and what could not have been got from others, and under danger, or in such like straits. May we not say, that as utility is the motive of the friendship, the advantage conferred on the receiver must be the standard? Because he it is who requests the kindness, and the other serves him in his need on the understanding that he is to get an equivalent. The assistance rendered is then exactly proportionate to the advantage which the receiver has obtained, and he should therefore repay as much as he gained by it, or even more, this being more creditable. In friendships based on goodness, the question, of course, is never raised, but herein the motive of the doer seems to be the proper standard, since virtue and moral character depend principally on motive. Chapter 14. Quarrels arise also in those friendships in which the parties are unequal because each party thinks himself entitled to the greater share, and of course, when this happens, the friendship is broken up. The man who is better than the other thinks that having the greater share pertains to him of right, for that more is always awarded to the good man, and similarly the man who is more profitable to another than that other to him. One who is useless, they say, ought not to share equally, for it comes to a tax, and not a friendship, unless the fruits of the friendship are reaped in proportion to the works done. Their notion being, that as in a money partnership they who contribute more receive. More so should it be in friendship likewise. On the other hand, the needy man and the less virtuous advance the opposite claim. They urge that it is the very business of a good friend to help those who are in need. Else what is the use of having a good or powerful friend if one is not to reap the advantage at all? Now each seems to advance a right claim and to be entitled to get more out of the connection than the other, only not more of the same thing. But the superior man should receive more respect, the needy man more profit, respect being the reward of goodness and beneficence, profit being the aid of need. This is plainly the principle acted upon in political communities. He receives no honor who gives no good to the common stock, for the property of the public is given to him who does good to the public, and honor is the property of the public. It is not possible both to make money out of the public and receive honor likewise, because no one will put up with the less in every respect. So to him who suffers loss as regards money they award honor, but money to him who can be paid by gifts. Since, as has been stated before, the observing due proportion equalizes and preserves friendship. Like rules then should be observed in the intercourse of friends who are unequal, and to him who advantages another in respect of money, or goodness, that other should repay honor, making requital according to his power, because friendship requires what is possible, not what is strictly due, this being not possible in all cases, as in the honors paid to the gods and to parents. No man could ever make the due return in these cases. And so he is thought to be a good man who pays respect, according to his ability. For this reason it may be judged never to be allowable for a son to disown his father, whereas a father may his son, because he that owes is bound to pay. Now a son can never, by anything he has done, fully requite the benefits first conferred on him by his father, and so is always a debtor. But they to whom anything is owed may cast off their debtors. Therefore the father may his son. But at the same time it must perhaps be admitted that it seems no father ever would sever himself utterly from a son, except in a case of exceeding depravity. Because, independently of the natural friendship, it is like human nature not to put away from oneself the assistance which a son might render. But to the son, if depraved, assisting his father is a thing to be avoided, or at least one which he will not be very anxious to do, most men being willing enough to receive kindness, but averse to doing it as unprofitable. Let thus much suffice on these points. Book 9. Chapter 1. Well, in all the friendships the parties to which are dissimilar it is the proportionate which equalizes and preserves the friendship, as has been already stated. I mean, in the social friendship the cobbler, for instance, gets an equivalent for his shoes after a certain rate, and the weaver, and all others in like manner. Now in this case a common measure has been provided in money, and to this accordingly all things are referred and by this are measured. But in the friendship of love the complaint is sometimes from the lover that, though he loves exceedingly, his love is not requited, he having perhaps all the time nothing that can be the object of friendship. Again, oftentimes from the object of love that he who as a suitor promised any and everything now performs nothing. These cases occur because the friendship of the lover for the beloved object is based upon pleasure, that of the other for him upon utility, and in one of the parties the requisite quality is not found, for, as these are respectively the grounds of the friendship comes to be broken up because the motives to it cease to exist. The parties loved not one another but qualities in one another which are not permanent. And so either are the friendships, whereas the friendship based upon the moral character of the parties, being independent and disinterested, is permanent, as we have already stated. Quarrels arise also when the parties realize different results, and not those which they desire. For the not attaining one special object is all one, in this case, with getting nothing at all, as in the well-known case where a man made promises to a musician, rising in proportion to the excellence of his music. But when, the next morning, the musician claimed the performance of his promises, he said that he had given him pleasure for pleasure. Of course, if each party had intended this, it would have been all right. But if the one desires amusement, and the other gain, and the one gets his object but the other not, the dealing cannot be fair, because a man fixes his mind upon what he happens to want, and will give so and so for that specific thing. The question then arises, who is to fix the rate? The man who first gives, or the man who first takes? Because, prima facie, the man who first gives seems to leave the rate to be fixed by the other party. This, they say, was in fact the practice of Protagoras. When he taught a man anything he would bid the learner estimate the worth of the knowledge gained by his own private opinion, and then he used to take so much from him. In such cases some people adopt the rule, with specified reward a friend should be content. They are certainly fairly found fault with who take the money in advance and then do nothing of what they said they would do, their promises having been so far beyond their ability. For such men do not perform what they agreed. The sophists, however, are perhaps obliged to take this course, because no one would give a sixpence for their knowledge. These then, I say, are fairly found fault with, because they do not what they have already taken money for doing. In cases where no stipulation as to the respective services is made, they who disinterestedly do the first service will not raise the question, as we have said before, because it is the nature of friendship, based on mutual goodness, to be referenced to the intention of the other, the intention being characteristic of the true friend and of goodness. And it would seem the same rules should be laid down for those who are connected with one another as teachers and learners of philosophy. For here the value of the commodity cannot be measured by money, and in fact, an exactly equivalent price cannot be set upon it, but perhaps it is sufficient to do what one can, as in the case of the gods or one's parents. But where the original giving is not upon these terms but avowedly for some return, the most proper course is perhaps for the requital to be such as both shall allow to be proportionate, and where this cannot be, then for the receiver to fix the value would seem to be not only necessary but also fair, because when the first giver gets that which is equivalent to the advantage received by the other, or to what he would have given to secure the pleasure he has had, then he has the value from him. For not only is this seen to be the course adopted in matters of buying and selling, but also in some places the law does not allow of actions upon voluntary dealings, on the principle that when one man has trusted another he must be content to have the obligation discharged in the same spirit as he originally contracted it. That is to say, it is thought fairer for the trusted, than for the trusting, party, to fix the value. For, in general, those who have and those who wish to get things do not set the same value on them. What is their own, and what they give in each case, appears to them worth a great deal. But yet the return is made according to the estimate of those who have received first. It should perhaps be added that the receiver should estimate what he has received, not by the value he sets upon it now that he has it, but by that which he set upon it before he obtained it. Chapter 2. Questions also arise upon such points as the following: whether one's father has an unlimited claim on one's services and obedience, or whether the sick man is to obey his physician, or, in an election of a general, the warlike qualities of the candidates should be alone regarded? In like manner, whether one should do a service rather to one's friend or to a good man, whether one should rather requite a benefactor or give to one's companion, supposing that both are not within one's power? Is not the true answer that it is no easy task to determine all such questions accurately, inasmuch as they involve numerous differences of all kinds, in respect of amount, and what is honorable, and what is necessary? It is obvious, of course, that no one person can unite in himself all claims. Again, the requital of benefits is, in general, a higher duty than doing unsolicited kindnesses to one's companion. In other words, the discharging of a debt is more obligatory upon one than the duty of giving to a companion. And yet this rule may admit of exceptions. For instance, which is the higher duty? For one who has been ransomed out of the hands of robbers to ransom and return his ransomer, be he who he may, or to repay him on his demand though he has not been taken by robbers, or to ransom his own father? For it would seem that a man ought to ransom his father even in preference to himself. Well then, as has been said already, as a general rule the debt should be discharged, but if in a particular case the giving greatly preponderates as being either honorable or necessary, we must be swayed by these considerations. I mean, in some cases the requital of the obligation previously existing may not be equal. Suppose, for instance, that the original benefactor has conferred a kindness on a good man, knowing him to be such, whereas this said good man has to repay it believing him to be a scoundrel. And again, in certain cases no obligation lies on a man to lend to one who has lent to him. Suppose, for instance, that a bad man lent to him, as being a good man, under the notion that he should get repaid, whereas the said good man has no hope of repayment from him being a bad man. Either then the case is really as we have supposed it, and then the claim is not equal, or it is not so but supposed to be, and still in so acting people are not to be thought to act wrongly. In short, as has been oftentimes stated before, all statements regarding feelings and actions can be definite only in proportion as their object matter is so. It is of course quite obvious that all people have not the same claim upon one, nor are the claims of one's father unlimited, just as Jupiter does not claim all kinds of sacrifice without distinction, and since the claims of parents, brothers, companions, and benefactors are all different, we must give to each what belongs to and befits each. And this is seen to be the course commonly pursued. To marriages men commonly invite their relatives, because these are from a common stock and therefore all the actions in any way pertaining thereto are common also. And to funerals men think that relatives ought to assemble in preference to other people, for the same reason. And it would seem that in respect of maintenance it is our duty to assist our parents in preference to all others, as being their debtors, and because it is more honorable to succor in these respects the authors of our existence than ourselves. Honor likewise we ought to pay to our parents just as to the gods, but then, not all kinds of honor, not the same, for instance, to a father as to a mother, nor again to a father the honor due to a scientific man or to a general, but that which is a father's due, and in like manner to a mother that which is a mother's. To all our elders also the honor befitting their age, by rising up in their presence, turning out of the way for them, and all similar marks of respect. To our companions again, or brothers, frankness and free participation in all we have. And to those of the same family, or tribe, or city, with ourselves, and all similarly connected with us, we should constantly try to render their due, and to discriminate what belongs to each in respect of nearness of connection, or goodness, or intimacy. Of course, in the case of those of the same class the discrimination is easier. In that of those who are in different classes it is a matter of more trouble. This, however, should not be a reason for giving up the attempt, but we must observe the distinction so far as it is practicable to do so. Chapter 3. A question is also raised as to the propriety of dissolving or not dissolving those friendships the parties to which do not remain what they were when the connection was formed. Now surely in respect of those whose motive to friendship is utility or pleasure there can be nothing wrong in breaking up the connection when they no longer have those qualities, because they were friends, not of one another, but of those qualities. And these having failed, it is only reasonable to expect that they should cease to entertain the sentiment. But a man has reason to find fault if the other party, being really attached to him because of advantage or pleasure, pretended to be so because of his moral character. In fact, as we said at the commencement, the most common source of quarrels between friends is their not being friends on the same grounds as they suppose themselves to be. Now, when a man has been deceived in having supposed himself to excite the sentiment of friendship by reason of his moral character, the other party doing nothing to indicate he has but himself to blame, but when he has been deceived by the pretense of the other he has a right to find fault with the man who has so deceived him, even more than with utterers of false coin, in proportion to the greater preciousness of that which is the object matter of the villainy. But suppose a man takes up another as being a good man, who turns out, and is found by him, to be a scoundrel, is he bound still to entertain friendship for him? Or may we not say at once it is impossible? Since it is not everything which is the object matter of friendship, but only that which is good, and so there is no obligation to be a bad man's friend, nor, in fact, ought one to be such, for one ought not to be a lover of evil, nor to be assimilated to what is base, which would be implied, because we have said before, like is friendly to like. Are we then to break with him instantly? Not in all cases. Only where our friends are incurably depraved. When there is a chance of amendment we are bound to aid in repairing the moral character of our friends even more than their substance, in proportion as it is better and more closely related to friendship. Still he who should break off the connection is not to be judged to act wrongly, for he never was a friend to such a character as the other now is, and therefore, since the man is changed and he cannot reduce him to his original state, he backs out of the connection. To put another case, suppose that one party remains what he was when the friendship was formed, while the other becomes morally improved and widely different from his friend in goodness. Is the improved character to treat the other as a friend? May we not say it is impossible? The case, of course, is clearest where there is a great difference, as in the friendships of boys. For suppose that of two boyish friends the one still continues a boy in mind and the other becomes a man of the highest character, how can they be friends? Since they either are pleased with the same objects nor alike and dislike the same things, for these points will not belong to them as regards one another, and without them it was assumed they cannot be friends because they cannot live in intimacy, and of the case of those who cannot do so we have spoken before. Well then, is the improved party to bear himself towards his former friend in no way differently to what he would have done had the connection never existed? Surely he ought to bear in mind the intimacy of past times, And just as we think ourselves bound to do favors for our friends in preference to strangers, so to those who have been friends and are so no longer we should allow somewhat on the score of previous friendship, whenever the cause of severance is not excessive depravity on their part. Chapter 4. Now the friendly feelings which are exhibited towards our friends, and by which friendships are characterized, seem to have sprung out of those which we entertain toward ourselves. I mean, people define a friend to be one who intends and does what is good, or what he believes to be good, to another for that other's sake, or one who wishes his friend to be and to live for that friend's own sake. Which is the feeling of mothers towards their children, and of friends who have come into collision. Others again, one who lives with another and chooses the same objects, or one who sympathizes with his friend in his sorrows and in his joys. This too is especially the case with mothers. Well, by some one of these marks people generally characterize friendship, and each of these the good man has towards himself, and all others have them in so far as they suppose themselves to be good. For, as has been said before, goodness, that is the good man, seems to be a measure to every one else. For he is at unity in himself, and with every part of his soul he desires the same objects, and he wishes for himself both what is, and what he believes to be, good, and he does it, it being characteristic of the good man to work at what is good, and for the sake of himself, inasmuch as he does it for the sake of his intellectual principle which is generally thought to be a man's self. Again, he wishes himself, and specially this principle whereby he is an intelligent being, to live and be preserved in life, because existence is a good to him, that is a good man. But it is to himself that each individual wishes what is good, and no man, conceiving the possibility of his becoming other than he now is, chooses that new self should have all things indiscriminately. A god, for instance, has at the present moment the chief good, but he has it in right of being whatever he actually now is, and the intelligent principle must be judged to be each man's self, or at least eminently so. Though other principles help, of course, to constitute him the man he is. Furthermore, the good man wishes to continue to live with himself, for he can do it with pleasure, in that his memories of past actions are full of delight, and his anticipations of the future are good, and such are pleasurable. Then, again, he has good store of matter for his intellect to contemplate, and he most especially sympathizes with his self in its griefs and joys, because the objects which give him pain and pleasure are at all times the same, not one thing today and a different one tomorrow, because he is not given to repentance, if one may so speak. It is then because each of these feelings are entertained by the good man towards his own self, and a friend feels towards a friend as towards himself, a friend being in fact another self, that friendship is thought to be some one of these things, and they are accounted friends in whom they are found. Whether or no there can really be friendship between a man and his self is a question we will not at present entertain. There may be thought to be friendship, in so far as there are two or more of the aforesaid requisites, and because the highest degree of friendship, and the usual acceptation of that term, resembles the feeling entertained by a man towards himself. But it may be urged that the aforesaid requisites are to all appearance found in the common run of men, though they are men of a low stamp. May it not be answered that they share in them only in so far as they please themselves, and conceive themselves to be good? For certainly, they are not either really, or even apparently, found in any one of those who are very depraved and villainous. We may almost say not even in those who are bad men at all, for they are at variance with themselves and lust after different things from those which in cool reason they wish for, just as men who fail of self-control. I mean, they choose things which, though hurtful, are pleasurable, in preference to those which in their own minds they believe to be good. Others again, from cowardice and indolence, decline to do what still they are convinced is best for them, while they who from their depravity have actually done many dreadful actions hate and avoid life, and accordingly kill themselves, and the wicked seek others in whose company to spend their time, but fly from themselves because they have many unpleasant subjects of memory, and can only look forward to others like them when in solitude, but drown their remorse in the company of others, and as they have nothing to raise the sentiment of friendship, so they never feel it towards themselves. Neither, in fact, can they who are of this character sympathize with themselves in their joys and sorrows, because their soul is, as it were, rent by faction, and the one principle, by reason of the depravity in them, is grieved at abstaining from certain things, while the other and better principle is pleased thereat, and the one drags them this way and the other that way, as though actually tearing them asunder. And though it is impossible actually to have at the same time the sensations of pain and pleasure, yet after a little time the man is sorry for having been pleased, and he could wish that those objects had not given him pleasure, for the wicked are full of remorse. It is plain then that the wicked man cannot be in the position of a friend even towards himself, because he has in himself nothing which can excite the sentiment of friendship. If then to be thus is exceedingly wretched, it is a man's duty to flee from wickedness with all his might and to strive to be good, because thus may he be friends with himself and may come to be a friend to another. Chapter 5. Kindly feeling, though resembling friendship, is not identical with it, because it may exist in reference to those whom we do not know and without the object of it being aware of its existence, which friendship cannot. This, by the way, has also been said before. And further, it is not even affection because it does not imply intensity nor yearning, which are both consequences of affection. Again, affection requires intimacy, but kindly feeling may arise quite suddenly, as happens sometimes in respect of men against whom people are matched in any way. I mean, they come to be kindly disposed to them and sympathize in their wishes, but still they would not join them in any action, because, as we said, they conceive this feeling of kindness suddenly, and so have but a superficial liking. What it does seem to be is the starting point of a friendship, just as pleasure, received through the sight, is the commencement of love, for no one falls in love without being first pleased with the personal appearance of the beloved object, and yet he who takes pleasure in it does not therefore necessarily love, but when he wearies for the object in its absence and desires its presence. Exactly in the same way men cannot be friends without having passed through the stage of kindly feeling, and yet they who are in that stage do not necessarily advance to friendship. They merely have an inert wish for the good of those toward whom they entertain the feeling, but would not join them in any action, nor put themselves out of the way for them. So that, in a metaphorical way of speaking, one might say that it is dormant friendship, and when it has endured for a space and ripened into intimacy comes to be real friendship, but not that whose object is advantage or pleasure, because such motives cannot produce even kindly feeling. I mean, he who has received a kindness requites it by kindly feeling towards his benefactor, and is right in so doing, but he who wishes another to be prosperous, because he has hope of advantage through his instrumentality, does not seem to be kindly disposed to that person but rather to himself, just as neither is he his friend if he pays court to him for any interested purpose. Kindly feeling always arises by reason of goodness and a certain amiability. When one man gives another the notion of being a fine fellow, or brave man, etc., as we said was the case sometimes with those matched against one another. Chapter 6. Unity of sentiment is also plainly connected with friendship, and therefore is not the same as unity of opinion, because this might exist even between people unacquainted with one another. Nor do men usually say people are united in sentiment merely because they agree in opinion on any point, as, for instance, on points of astronomical science, unity of sentiment herein not having any connection with friendship, but they say that communities have unity of sentiment when they agree respecting points of expediency and take the same line and carry out what has been determined in common consultation. Thus we see that unity of sentiment has for its object matters of action, and such of these as are of importance, and of mutual, or, in the case of single states, common, interest, when, for instance, all agree in the choice of magistrates, or forming alliance with the Lacedaemonians, or appointing Pittacus ruler, that is to say, supposing he himself was willing. But when each wishes himself to be in power, as the brothers in the Phoenici, they quarrel and form parties, for, plainly, unity of sentiment does not merely imply that each entertains the same idea be it what it may, but that they do so in respect of the same object, as when both the populace and the sensible men of a state desire that the best men should be in office, because then all attain their object. Thus unity of sentiment is plainly a social friendship, as it is also said to be, since it has for its object matter things expedient and relating to life. And this unity exists among the good, for they have it towards themselves and towards one another, being, if I may be allowed the expression, in the same position. I mean, the wishes of such men are steady and do not ebb and flow like the Euripus, and they wish what is just and expedient, and aim at these things in common. The bad, on the contrary, can as little have unity of sentiment as they can be real friends, except to a very slight extent, desiring as they do unfair advantage in things profitable, while they shirk labor and service for the common good. And while each man wishes for these things for himself, he is jealous of and hinders his neighbor, and as they do not watch over the common good, it is lost. The result is that they quarrel while they are for keeping one another to work but are not willing to perform their just share. Chapter 7. Benefactors are commonly held to have more friendship for the objects of their kindness than these for them, and the fact is made a subject of discussion and inquiry, as being contrary to reasonable expectation. The account of the matter which satisfies most persons is that the one are debtors and the others creditors, and therefore that, as in the case of actual loans, the debtors wish their creditors out of the way while the creditors are anxious for the preservation of their debtors, so those who have done kindnesses desire the continued existence of the people they have done them to, under the notion of getting a return of their good offices, while these are not particularly anxious about requital. Epicharmus, I suspect, would very probably say that they who give this solution judge from their own baseness. Yet it certainly is like human nature, for the generality of men have short memories on these points, and aim rather at receiving than conferring benefits. But the real cause, it would seem, rests upon nature, and the case is not parallel to that of creditors, because in this there is no affection to the persons, but merely a wish for their preservation with a view to the return, whereas, in point of fact, they who have done kindnesses feel friendship and love for those to whom they have done them, even though they neither are, nor can by possibility hereafter be, in a position to serve their benefactors. And this is the case also with artisans. Every one, I mean, feels more affection for his own work than that work possibly could for him if it were animate. It is perhaps specially the case with poets, for these entertain very great affection for their poems, loving them as their own children. It is to this kind of thing I should be inclined to compare the case of benefactors, for the object of their kindness is their own work, and so they love this more than this loves its creator. And the account of this is that existence is to all a thing choice-worthy and an object of affection. Now we exist by acts of working, that is, by living and acting. He then that has created a given work exists, it may be said, by his act of working. Therefore he loves his work because he loves existence. And this is natural, for the work produced displays and act what existed before potentially. Then again, the benefactor has a sense of honor and right of his action, so that he may well take pleasure in him in whom this resides. But to him who has received the benefit there is nothing honorable in respect of his benefactor, only something advantageous which is both less pleasant and less the object of friendship. Again, pleasure is derived from the actual working out of a present action, from the anticipation of a future one, and from the recollection of a past one. But the highest pleasure and special object of affection is that which attends on the actual working. Now the benefactor's work abides, for the honorable is enduring, but the advantage of him who has received the kindness passes away. Again, there is pleasure in recollecting honorable actions, but in recollecting advantageous ones there is none at all or much less. By the way, though, the contrary is true of the expectation of advantage. Further, the entertaining the feeling of friendship is like acting on another, but being the object of the feeling is like being acted upon. So then, entertaining the sentiment of friendship, and all feelings connected with it, attend on those who, in the given case of a benefaction, are the superior party. Once more, all people value most what has cost them much labor in the production. For instance, people who have themselves made their money are fonder of it than those who have inherited it. And receiving kindness is, it seems, unlaborious, but doing it is laborious. And this is the reason why the female parents are most fond of their offspring, for their part in producing them is attended with most labor, and they know more certainly that they are theirs. This feeling would seem also to belong to benefactors. Chapter 8. A question is also raised as to whether it is right to love oneself best, or someone else, because men find fault with those who love themselves best, and call them in a disparaging way lovers of self, and the bad man is thought to do everything he does for his own sake merely, and the more so the more depraved he is. Accordingly men reproach him with never doing anything unselfish, whereas the good man acts from a sense of honor. And the more so the better man he is, and for his friends. Sake, and is careless of his own interest. But with these theories facts are at variance, and not unnaturally, for it is commonly said also that a man is to love most him who is most his friend, and he is most a friend who wishes good to him to whom he wishes it for that man's sake even though no one knows. Now these conditions, and in fact all the rest by which a friend is characterized, belong specially to each individual in respect of his self, for we have said before that all the friendly feelings are derived to others from those which have self primarily for their object. And all the current proverbs support this view. For instance, one's soul, the goods of friends are common, equality is a tie of friendship, the knee is nearer than the shin. For all these things exist specially with reference to a man's own self. He is specially a friend to himself, and so he is bound to love himself the most. It is with good reason questioned which of the two parties one should follow, both having plausibility on their side. Perhaps then, in respect of theories of this kind, the proper course is to distinguish and define how far each is true, and in what way. If we could ascertain the sense in which each uses the term self-loving, this point might be cleared up. Well now, they who use it disparagingly give the name to those who, in respect of wealth, and honors, and pleasures of the body, give to themselves the larger share, because the mass of mankind grasp after these and are earnest about them as being the best things, which is the reason why they are matters of contention. They who are covetous in regard to these gratify their lusts and passions in general, that is to say the irrational part of their soul. Now the mass of mankind are so disposed, for which reason the appellation has taken its rise from that mass which is low and bad. Of course they are justly reproached who are self-loving in this sense. And that the generality of men are accustomed to apply the term to denominate those who do give such things to themselves is quite plain. Suppose, for instance, that a man were anxious to do, more than other men, acts of justice, or self-mastery, or any other virtuous acts, and, in general, were to secure to himself that which is abstractedly noble and honorable, no one would call him self-loving, nor blame him. Yet might such an one be judged to be more truly self-loving. Certainly he gives to himself the things which are most noble and most good, and gratifies that principle of his nature which is most rightfully authoritative, and obeys it in everything. And just as that which possesses the highest authority is thought to constitute a community, or any other system, so also in the case of man. And so he is most truly self-loving who loves and gratifies this principle. Again, men are said to have, or to fail of having, self-control, according as the intellect controls or not, it being plainly implied thereby that this principle constitutes each individual. And people are thought to have done of themselves, and voluntarily, those things specially which are done with reason. It is plain, therefore, that this principle does, either entirely or specially constitute the individual man, and that the good man specially loves this. For this reason then he must be specially self-loving, in a kind other than that which is reproached, and as far superior to it as living in accordance with reason is to living at the beck and call of passion, and aiming at the truly noble to aiming at apparent advantage. Now all approve and commend those who are eminently earnest about honorable actions, and if all would vie with one another in respect of the capal philandinu, and be intent upon doing what is most truly noble and honorable, society at large would have all that is proper while each individual in particular would have the greatest of goods, virtue being assumed to be such. And so the good man ought to be self-loving, because by doing what is noble he will have advantage himself and will do good to others. But the bad man ought not to be, because he will harm himself and his neighbors by following low and evil passions. In the case of the bad man, what he ought to do and what he does are at variance, but the good man does what he ought to do, because all intellect chooses what is best for itself, and the good man puts himself under the direction of intellect. Of the good man it is true likewise that he does many things for the sake of his friends and his country, even to the extent of dying for them, if need be, for money and honors, and in short, all the good things which others fight for, he will throw away while eager to secure to himself the capal philandinu. He will prefer a brief and great joy to a tame and enduring one, and to live nobly for 1 year rather than ordinarily for many, and one great and noble action to many trifling ones. And this is perhaps that which befalls men who die for their country and friends. They choose great glory for themselves, and they will lavish their own money that their friends may receive more. For hereby the friend gets the money, but the man himself the honor. So, in fact, he gives to himself the greater good. It is the same with honors and offices. All these things he will give up to his friend, because this reflects honor and praise on himself. And so with good reason is he esteemed a fine character, since he chooses the honorable before all things else. It is possible also to give up the opportunities of action to a friend, and to have caused a friend's doing a thing may be more noble than having done it oneself. In short, in all praiseworthy things the good man does plainly give to himself a larger share of the honorable. In this sense it is right to be self-loving, in the vulgar acceptation of the term it is not. Chapter 9. A question is raised also respecting the happy man, whether he will want friends or no. Some say that they who are blessed and independent have no need of friends, for they already have all that is good, and so, as being independent, want nothing further. Whereas the notion of a friend's office is to be as it were a second self and procure for a man what he cannot get by himself, hence the saying, "When fortune gives us good, what need we friends?" On the other hand, it looks absurd, while we are assigning to the happy man all other good things, not to give him friends, which are, after all, thought to be the greatest of external goods. Again, if it is more characteristic of a friend to confer than to receive kindnesses, and if to be beneficent belongs to the good man and to the character of virtue, and if it is more noble to confer kindnesses on friends than strangers, the good man will need objects for his benefactions. And out of this last consideration springs a question whether the need of friends be greater in prosperity or adversity, since the unfortunate man wants people to do him kindnesses and they who are fortunate want objects for their kind acts. Again, it is perhaps absurd to make our happy man a solitary, because no man would choose the possession of all goods in the world on the condition of solitariness, man being a social animal and formed by nature for living with others. Of course the happy man has this qualification since he has all those things which are good by nature. And it is obvious that the society of friends and good men must be preferable to that of strangers and ordinary people, and we conclude, therefore, that the happy man does need friends. But then, what do they mean whom we quoted first, and how are they right? Is it not that the mass of mankind mean by friends those who are useful? And of course the happy man will not need such because he has all good things already. Either will he need such as are friends with a view to the pleasurable, or at least only to a slight extent, because his life, being already pleasurable, does not want pleasure imported from without. And so, since the happy man does not need friends of these kinds, he is thought not to need any at all. But it may be, this is not true, for it was stated originally, that happiness is a kind of working. Now working plainly is something that must come into being, not be already there like a mere piece of property. If then the being happy consists in living and working, and the good man's working is in itself excellent and pleasurable, as we said at the commencement of the treatise, and if what is our own reckons among things pleasurable, and if we can view our neighbors better than ourselves and their actions better than we can our own, then the actions of their friends who are good men are pleasurable to the good, inasmuch as they have both the requisites, which are naturally pleasant. So the man in the highest state of happiness will need friends of this kind, since he desires to contemplate good actions, and actions of his own, which those of his friend, being a good man, are. Again, common opinion requires that the happy man live with pleasure to himself. Now life is burthensome to a man in solitude, for it is not easy to work continuously by oneself, but in company with, and in regard to others, it is easier, and therefore the working, being pleasurable in itself, will be more continuous, a thing which should be in respect of the happy man, for the good man, in that he is good, takes pleasure in the actions which accord with virtue and is annoyed at those which spring from vice, just as a musical man is pleased with beautiful music and annoyed by bad. And besides, as Diogenes says, virtue itself may be improved by practice, from living with the good. And upon the following considerations, more purely metaphysical, it will probably appear that the good friend is naturally choice-worthy to the good man. We have said before, that whatever is naturally good is also in itself good and pleasant to the good man. Now the fact of living, so far as animals are concerned, is characterized generally by the power of sentience. In man it is characterized by that of sentience, or of rationality, the faculty of course being referred to the actual operation of the faculty. Certainly the main point is the actual operation of it, so that living seems mainly to consist in the act of sentience or exerting rationality. Now the fact of living is in itself one of the things that are good and pleasant, for it is a definite totality, and whatever is such belongs to the nature of good, but what is naturally good is good to the good man, for which reason it seems to be pleasant to all. Of course one must not suppose a life which is depraved and corrupted, nor one spent in pain, for that which is such is indefinite as are its inherent qualities. However, what is to be said of pain will be clearer in what is to follow. If then the fact of living is in itself good and pleasant, and this appears from the fact that all desire it, and especially those who are good and in high happiness, their course of life being most choice-worthy and their existence most choice-worthy likewise, then also he that sees perceives that he sees, and he that hears perceives that he hears, and he that walks perceives that he walks. And in all the other instances in like manner there is a faculty which reflects upon and perceives the fact that we are working, so that we can perceive that we perceive and intellectually know that we intellectually know. But to perceive that we perceive or that we intellectually know is to perceive that we exist, since existence was defined to be perceiving or intellectually knowing. Now to perceive that one lives is a thing pleasant in itself, life being a thing naturally good, and the perceiving of the presence in ourselves of things naturally good being pleasant. Therefore the fact of living is choice-worthy, and to the good specially so, since existence is good and pleasant to them, for they receive pleasure from the internal consciousness of that which in itself is good. But the good man is to his friend as to himself, friend being but a name for a second self. Therefore as his own existence is choice-worthy to each, so too, or similarly at least, is his friend's existence. But the ground of one's own existence being choice-worthy is the perceiving of one's self being good, any such perception being in itself pleasant. Therefore one ought to be thoroughly conscious of one's friend's existence, which will result from living with him, that is, sharing in his words and thoughts. For this is the meaning of the term as applied to the human species, not mere feeding together as in the case of brutes. If then to the man in a high state of happiness existence is in itself choice-worthy, being naturally good and pleasant, and so too a friend's existence, then the friend also must be among things choice-worthy. But whatever is choice-worthy to a man he should have, or else he will be in this point deficient. The man therefore who is to come up to our notion, happy, will need good friends. Chapter 10. Are we then to make our friends as numerous as possible? Or, as in respect of acquaintance it is thought to have been well said, have not thou many acquaintances, yet be not without. So too in respect of friendship may we adopt the precept, and say that a man should not be without friends, nor again have exceeding many friends? Now as for friends who are intended for use, the maxim I have quoted will, it seems, fit in exceedingly well, because to requite the services of many is a matter of labor, and a whole life would not be long enough to do this for them. So that, if more numerous than what will suffice for one's own life, they become officious, and are hindrances in respect of living well, and so we do not want them. And again of those who are to be for pleasure a few are quite enough, just like sweetening in our food. But of the good are we to make as many as ever we can, or is there any measure of the number of friends, as there is of the number to constitute a political community? I mean, you cannot make 1 out of 10 men, and if you increase the number to 100,000 it is not any longer a community. However, the number is not perhaps some one definite number, but any between certain extreme limits. Well, of friends likewise there is a limited number, which perhaps may be laid down to be the greatest number with whom it would be possible to keep up intimacy, this being thought to be one of the greatest marks of friendship, and it being quite obvious that it is not possible to be intimate with many, in other words, to part one's self among many. And besides it must be remembered that they also are to be friends to one another if they are all to live together, but it is a matter of difficulty to find this in many men at once. It comes likewise to be difficult to bring home to oneself the joys and sorrows of many, because in all probability one would have to sympathize at the same time with the joys of this one and the sorrows of that other. Perhaps then it is well not to endeavor to have very many friends, but so many as are enough for intimacy, because, in fact, it would seem not to be possible to be very much a friend to many at the same time, and for the same reason, not to be in love with many objects at the same time, love being a kind of excessive friendship which implies but one object. And all strong emotions must be limited in the number towards whom they are felt. And if we look to facts, this seems to be so, for not many at a time become friends in the way of companionship. All the famous friendships of the kind are between two persons, whereas they who have many friends, and meet everybody on the footing of intimacy, seem to be friends really to no one except in the way of general society. I mean the characters denominated as overcomplaisant. To be sure, in the way merely of society, a man may be a friend to many without being necessarily overcomplaisant, but being truly good. But one cannot be a friend to many because of their virtue, and for the person's own sake. In fact, it is a matter for contentment to find even a few such. Chapter 11. Again, are friends most needed in prosperity or in adversity? They are required, we know, in both states, because the unfortunate need help and the prosperous want people to live with and to do kindnesses to, for they have a desire to act kindly to someone. To have friends is more necessary in adversity, and therefore in this case useful ones are wanted, and to have them in prosperity is more honorable, and this is why the prosperous want good men for friends, it being preferable to confer benefits on, and to live with, these. For the very presence of friends is pleasant even in adversity, since men when grieved are comforted by the sympathy of their friends. And from this, by the way, the question might be raised, whether it is that they do in a manner take part of the weight of calamities, or only that their presence, being pleasurable, and the consciousness of their sympathy, make the pain of the sufferer less. However, we will not further discuss whether these which have been suggested or some other causes produce the relief. At least the effect we speak of is a matter of plain fact. But their presence has probably a mixed effect. I mean, not only is the very seeing friends pleasant, especially to one in misfortune, an actual help towards lessening the grief is afforded, the natural tendency of a friend, if he is gifted with tact, being to comfort by look and word, because he is well acquainted with the sufferer's temper and disposition and therefore knows what things give him pleasure and pain. But also the perceiving a friend to be grieved at his misfortunes causes the sufferer pain, because every one avoids being cause of pain to his friends. And for this reason they who are of a manly nature are cautious not to implicate their friends in their pain. And unless a man is exceedingly callous to the pain of others, he cannot bear the pain which is thus caused to his friends. In short, he does not admit men to wail with him, not being given to wail at all. Women, it is true, and men who resemble women, like to have others to groan with them, and love such as friends and sympathizers. But it is plain that it is our duty in all things to imitate the highest character. On the other hand, the advantages of friends in our prosperity are the pleasurable intercourse and the consciousness that they are pleased at our good fortune. It would seem, therefore, that we ought to call in friends readily on occasion of good fortune, because it is noble to be ready to do good to others, but on occasion of bad fortune, we should do so with reluctance, for we should as little as possible make others share in our ills, on which principle goes the saying, I am unfortunate, let that suffice. The most proper occasion for calling them in is when with small trouble or annoyance to themselves they can be of very great use to the person who needs them. But, on the contrary, it is fitting perhaps to go to one's friends in their misfortunes unasked and with alacrity, because kindness is the friend's office, and specially towards those who are in need and who do not demand it as a right, this being more creditable and more pleasant to both, and on occasion of their good fortune to go readily, if we can forward it in any way, because men need their friends for this likewise, but to be backward in sharing it, any great eagerness to receive. Advantage not being creditable. One should perhaps be cautious not to present the appearance of sullenness in declining the sympathy or help of friends, for this happens occasionally. It appears then that the presence of friends is, under all circumstances, choice-worthy. Chapter 12. May we not say then that, as seeing the beloved object is most prized by lovers and they choose this sense rather than any of the others because love is engendered in the eyes, with gazing fed? In like manner intimacy is to friends most choice-worthy, friendship being communion? Again, as a man is to himself so is he to his friend, Now with respect to himself the perception of his own existence is choice-worthy, therefore is it also in respect of his friend. And besides, their friendship is acted out in intimacy, and so with good reason they desire this. And whatever in each man's opinion constitutes existence, or whatsoever it is for the sake of which they choose life, herein they wish their friends to join with them. And so some men drink together, others gamble, others join in gymnastic exercises or hunting, others study philosophy together, in each case spending their days together in that which they like best of all things in life. For since they wish to be intimate with their friends, they do and partake in those things whereby they think to attain this object. Therefore the friendship of the wicked comes to be depraved, for, being unstable, they share in what is bad and become depraved in being made like to one another. But the friendship of the good is good, growing with their intercourse. They improve also, as it seems, by repeated acts, and by mutual correction, for they receive impress from one another in the points which give them pleasure. Whence says the poet, "Thou from the good, good things shalt surely learn." Here then we will terminate our discourse of friendship. The next thing is to go into the subject of pleasure. Book 10. Chapter 1. Next, it would seem, follows a discussion respecting pleasure, for it is thought to be most closely bound up with our kind, and so men train the young, guiding them on their course by the rudders of pleasure and pain. And to like and dislike what one ought is judged to be most important for the formation of good moral character, because these feelings extend all one's life through, giving a bias towards and exerting an influence on the side of virtue and happiness, since men choose what is pleasant and avoid what is painful. Subjects such as these, then, it would seem, we ought by no means to pass by, and especially since they involve much difference of opinion. There are those who call pleasure the chief good. There are others who on the contrary maintain that it is exceedingly bad, some perhaps from a real conviction that such is the case, others from a notion that it is better, in reference to our life and conduct, to show up pleasure as bad, even if it is not so really, arguing that, as the mass of men have a bias towards it, and are the slaves of their pleasures, it is right to draw them to the contrary, for that so they may possibly arrive at the mean. I confess I suspect the soundness of this policy. In matters respecting men's feelings and actions, theories are less convincing than facts. Whenever, therefore, they are found conflicting with actual experience, they not only are despised but involve the truth in their fall. He, for instance, who deprecates pleasure, if once seen to aim at it, gets the credit of backsliding to it as being universally such as he said it was. The mass of men being incapable of nice distinctions. Real accounts, therefore, of such matters seem to be most expedient, not with a view to knowledge merely but to life and conduct, for they are believed as being in harm with facts, and so they prevail with the wise to live in accordance with them. But of such considerations enough, let us now proceed to the current maxims respecting pleasure. Chapter 2. Now Eudoxus thought pleasure to be the chief good because he saw all, rational and irrational alike, aiming at it. And he argued that, since in all what was the object of choice must be good, and what most so the best, the fact of all being drawn to the same thing proved this thing to be the best for all. For each, he said, finds what is good for itself just as it does its proper nourishment, and so that which is good for all, and the object of the aim of all, is their chief good. And his theories were received, not so much for their own sake, as because of his excellent moral character. For he was thought to be eminently possessed of perfect self-mastery, and therefore it was not thought that he said these things because he was a lover of pleasure, but that he really was so convinced. And he thought his position was not less proved by the argument from the contrary. That is, since pain was in itself an object of avoidance, to all the contrary must be in like manner an object of choice. Again he urged that that is most choice-worthy which we choose, not by reason of, or with a view to, anything further, and that pleasure is confessedly of this kind because no one ever goes on to ask to what purpose he is pleased, feeling that pleasure is in itself choice-worthy. Again, that when added to any other good it makes it more choice-worthy, as, for instance, to actions of justice, or perfected self-mastery, and good can only be increased by itself. However, this argument at least seems to prove only that it belongs to the class of goods, and not that it does so more than anything else. For every good is more choiceworthy in combination with some other than when taken quite alone. In fact, it is by just such an argument that Plato proves that pleasure is not the chief good. For, says he, the life of pleasure is more choiceworthy in combination with practical wisdom than apart from it. But if the compound better than simple pleasure cannot be the chief good, because the very chief good cannot by any addition become choiceworthy than it is already. And it is obvious that nothing else can be the chief good, which by combination with any of the things in themselves, good comes to be more choiceworthy. What is there then of such a nature? Meaning, of course, whereof we can partake, because that which we are in search of must be such. As for those who object that what all aim at is not necessarily good, I confess I cannot see much in what they say, because what all think we say is. And he who would cut away this ground from under us will not bring forward things more dependable, because if the argument had rested on the desires of irrational creatures there might have been something in what he says, but since the rational also desire pleasure, how can his objection be allowed any weight? And it may be that, even in the lower animals, there is some natural good principle above themselves which aims at the good peculiar to them. Nor does that seem to be sound which is urged respecting the argument from the contrary. I mean, some people say, it does not follow that pleasure must be good because pain is evil, since evil may be opposed to evil, and both evil and good to what is indifferent. Now what they say is right enough in itself but does not hold in the present instance. If both pleasure and pain were bad both would have been objects of avoidance. Or if either then neither would have been, at all events they must have fared alike. But now men do plainly avoid the one as bad and choose the other as good, and so there is a complete opposition. Nor again is pleasure therefore excluded from being good because it does not belong to the class of qualities. The acts of virtue are not qualities, either is happiness, yet surely both are goods. Again, they say the chief good is limited but pleasure unlimited, in that it admits of degrees. Now if they judge this from the act of feeling pleasure, then the same thing will apply to justice and all the other virtues, in respect of which clearly it is said that men are more or less of such and such characters, according to the different virtues. They are more just or more brave, or one may practice justice and self-mastery more or less. If, on the other hand, they judge in respect of the pleasures themselves, then it may be they miss the true cause, namely that some are unmixed and others mixed. For just as health being in itself limited, admits of degrees, why should not pleasure do so and yet be limited? In the former case we account for it by the fact that there is not the same adjustment of parts in all men, nor one and the same always in the same individual. But health, though relaxed, remains up to a certain point, and differs in degrees. And of course the same may be the case with pleasure. Again, assuming the chief good to be perfect and all movements and generations imperfect, they tried to shew that pleasure is a movement and a generation. Yet they do not seem warranted in saying even that it is a movement, for to every movement are thought to belong swiftness and slowness, and if not in itself, as to that of the universe, yet relatively, but to pleasure neither of these belongs. For though one may have got quickly into the state pleasure, as into that of anger, one cannot be in the state quickly, nor relatively to the state of any other person. But we can walk or grow, and so on, quickly or slowly. Of course it is possible to change into the state of pleasure quickly or slowly, but to act in the state, by which, I mean, have the perception of pleasure, quickly, is not possible. And how can it be a generation? Because, according to notions generally held, not anything is generated from anything, but a thing resolves itself into that out of which it was generated, whereas of that of which pleasure is a generation, pain is a destruction. Again, they say that pain is a lack of something suitable to nature and pleasure a supply of it. But these are affections of the body. Now if pleasure really is a supplying of somewhat suitable to nature, that must feel the pleasure in which the supply takes place, therefore the body of course. Yet this is not thought to be so, either then is pleasure a supplying. Only a person of course will be pleased when a supply takes place just as he will be pained when he is cut short. This notion would seem to have arisen out of the pains and pleasures connected with natural nourishment. Because, when people have felt a lack and so have had pain first, they, of course, are pleased with the supply of their lack. But this is not the case with all pleasures. Those attendant on mathematical studies, for instance, are unconnected with any pain, and of such as attend on the senses those which arise through the sense of smell, and again, many sounds, and sights, and memories, and hopes. Now of what can these be generations? Because there has been here no lack of anything to be afterwards supplied. And to those who bring forward disgraceful pleasures we may reply that these are not really pleasant things, for it does not follow because they are pleasant to the ill-disposed that we are to admit that they are pleasant except to them, just as we should not say that those things are really wholesome, or sweet, or bitter, which are so to the sick, or those objects really white which give that impression to people laboring under ophthalmia. Or we might say thus, that the pleasures are choice-worthy but not as derived from these sources, just as wealth is, but not as the price of treason, or health, but not on the terms of eating anything however loathsome. Or again, may we not say that pleasures differ in kind? Those derived from honorable objects, for instance, are different from those arising from disgraceful ones, and it is not possible to experience the pleasure of the just man without being just, or of the musical man without being musical, and so on of others. The distinction commonly drawn between the friend and the flatterer would seem to show clearly either that pleasure is not a good, or that there are different kinds of pleasure, for the former is thought to have good as the object of his intercourse, the latter pleasure only, and this last is reproached, but the former men praise as having different objects in his intercourse. Again, no one would choose to live with a child's intellect all his life through, though receiving the highest possible pleasure from such objects as children receive it from, or to take pleasure in doing any of the most disgraceful things, though sure never to be pained. There are many things also about which we should be diligent even though they brought no pleasure, as seeing, remembering, knowing, possessing the various excellences, and the fact that pleasures do follow on these naturally makes no difference, because we should certainly choose them even though no pleasure resulted from them. It seems then to be plain that pleasure is not the chief good, nor is every kind of it choice-worthy, and that there are some choice-worthy in themselves, differing in kind, i.e. in the sources from which they are derived. Let this then suffice by way of an account of the current maxims respecting pleasure and pain. Chapter 3. Now what it is, and how characterized, will be more plain if we take up the subject afresh. An act of sight is thought to be complete at any moment, that is to say, it lacks nothing the accession of which subsequently will complete its whole nature. Well, pleasure resembles this, because it is a whole, as one may say, and one could not at any moment of time take a pleasure whose whole nature would be completed by its lasting for a longer time. And for this reason it is not a movement, for all movement takes place in time of certain duration and has a certain end to accomplish. For instance, the movement of house building is then only complete when the builder has produced what he intended, that is, either in the whole time necessary to complete the whole design, or in a given portion. But all the subordinate movements are incomplete in the parts of the time, and are different in kind from the whole movement and from one another. I mean, for instance, that the fitting the stones together is a movement different from that of fluting the column, and both again from the construction of the temple as a whole. But this last is complete as lacking nothing to the result proposed, whereas that of the basement, or of the triglyph, is incomplete, because each is a movement of a part, merely. As I said then, they differ in kind, and you cannot at any time you choose find a movement complete in its whole nature, but if at all, in the whole time requisite. And so it is with the movement of walking and all others, for, if motion be a movement from one place to another place, then of it too there are different kinds, flying, walking, leaping, and such like. And not only so, but there are different kinds even in walking, the wherefrom and whereto are not the same in the whole course as in a portion of it, nor in one portion as in another, nor is crossing this line the same as crossing that, because a man is not merely crossing a line but a line in a given place, and this is in a different place from that. Of movement I have discoursed exactly in another treatise. I will now therefore only say that it seems not to be complete at any given moment, and that most movements are incomplete and specifically different, since the whence and whither constitute different species. But of pleasure the whole nature is complete at any given moment. It is plain then that pleasure and movement must be different from one another, and that pleasure belongs to the class of things whole and complete. And this might appear also from the impossibility of moving except in a definite time, whereas there is none with respect to the sensation of pleasure, for what exists at the very present moment is a kind of whole. From these considerations, then, it is plain that people are not warranted in saying that pleasure is a movement or a generation, because these terms are not applicable to all things, only to such as are divisible and not wholes. I mean that of an act of sight there is no generation, nor is there of a point, nor of a monad, nor is any one of these a movement or a generation. Either then of pleasure is there movement or generation, because it is, as one may say, a whole. Chapter 4. Now, since every percipient faculty works upon the object answering to it, and perfectly the faculty in a good state upon the most excellent of the objects within its range, for perfect working is thought to be much what I have described, and we will not raise any question about saying, the faculty works, instead of that subject wherein the faculty resides. In each case the best working is that of the faculty in its best state upon the best of the objects answering to it. And this will be, further, most perfect and most pleasant, for pleasure is attendant upon every percipient faculty, and in like manner on every intellectual operation and speculation, and that is most pleasant which is most perfect, and that most perfect which is the working of the best faculty upon the most excellent of the objects within its range. And pleasure perfects the working. But pleasure does not perfect it in the same way as the faculty and object of perception do, being good, just as health and the physician are not in similar senses causes of a healthy state. And that pleasure does arise upon the exercise of every percipient faculty is evident, for we commonly say that sights and sounds are pleasant. It is plain also that this is especially the case when the faculty is most excellent and works upon a similar object, and when both the object and faculty of perception are such, pleasure will always exist, supposing of course an agent and a patient. Furthermore, pleasure perfects the act of working not in the way of an inherent state, but as a supervening finish, such as is bloom in people at their prime. Therefore, so long as the object of intellectual or sensitive perception is such as it should be, and also the faculty which discerns or realizes the object, there will be pleasure in the working. Because when that which has the capacity of being acted on and that which is apt to act are alike and similarly related, the same result follows naturally. How is it then that no one feels pleasure continuously? Is it not that he wearies, because all human faculties are incapable of unintermitting exertion, and so, of course, pleasure does not arise either, because that follows upon the act of working. But there are some things which please when new, but afterwards not in the like way, for exactly the same reason, that at first the mind is roused and works on these objects with its powers at full tension, just as they who are gazing steadfastly at anything. But afterwards the act of working is not of the kind it was at first, but careless, and so the pleasure too is dulled. Again, a person may conclude that all men grasp at pleasure, because all aim likewise at life, and life is an act of working, and every man works at and with those things which also he best likes. The musical man, for instance, works with his hearing at music, the studious man with his intellect at speculative questions, and so forth. And pleasure perfects the acts of working, and so life after which men grasp. No wonder then that they aim also at pleasure, because to each it perfects life, which is itself choice-worthy. We will take leave to omit the question whether we choose life for pleasure's sake of pleasure for life's sake, because these two plainly are closely connected and admit not of separation, since pleasure comes not into being without working, and again, every working pleasure perfects. And this is one reason why pleasures are thought to differ in kind, because we suppose that things which differ in kind must be perfected by things so differing, it plainly being the case with the productions of nature and art, as animals, and trees, and pictures, and statues, and houses, and furniture. And so we suppose that in like manner acts of working which are different in kind are perfected by things differing in kind. Now intellectual workings differ specifically from those of the senses, and these last from one another, therefore so do the pleasures which perfect them. This may be shown also from the intimate connection subsisting between each pleasure and the working which it perfects. I mean, that the pleasure proper to any working increases that working, for they who work with pleasure sift all things more closely and carry them out to a greater degree of nicety. For instance, those men become geometricians who take pleasure in geometry, and they apprehend particular points more completely. In like manner, men who are fond of music, or architecture, or anything else, improve each on his own pursuit, because they feel pleasure in them. Thus the pleasures aid in increasing the workings, and things which do so aid are proper and peculiar. But the things which are proper and peculiar to others specifically different are themselves also specifically different. Yet even more clearly may this be shown from the fact that the pleasures arising from one kind of workings hinder other workings. For instance, people who are fond of flute music cannot keep their attention to conversation or discourse when they catch the sound of a flute, because they take more pleasure in flute playing than in the working they are at the time engaged on. In other words, the pleasure attendant on flute playing destroys the working of conversation or discourse. Much the same kind of thing takes place in other cases, when a person is engaged in two different workings at the same time. That is, the pleasanter of the two keeps pushing out the other, and if the disparity in pleasantness be great, then more and more till a man even ceases altogether to work at the other. This is the reason why, when we are very much pleased with anything whatever, we do nothing else, and it is only when we are but moderately pleased with one occupation that we vary it with another. People, for instance, who eat sweetmeats in the theater do so most when the performance is indifferent. Since then the proper and peculiar pleasure gives accuracy to the workings and makes them more enduring and better of their kind, while those pleasures which are foreign to them mar them, it is plain there is a wide difference between them. In fact, pleasures foreign to any working have pretty much the same effect as the pains proper to it, which, in fact, destroy the workings. I mean, if one man dislikes writing, or another calculation, the one does not write, the other does not calculate. Because, in each case, the working is attended with some pain, so then contrary effects are produced upon the workings by the pleasures and pains proper to them, by which I mean those which arise upon the working, in itself, independently of any other circumstances. As for the pleasures foreign to a working, we have said already that they produce a similar effect to the pain proper to it. That is, they destroy the working, only not in like way. Well then, as workings differ from one another in goodness and badness, some being fit objects of choice, others of avoidance, and others in their nature indifferent, pleasures are similarly related, since its own proper pleasure attends or each working. Of course, that proper to a good working is good, that proper to a bad, bad, for even the desires for what is noble are praiseworthy, and for what is base blameworthy. Furthermore, the pleasures attendant on workings are more closely connected with them even than the desires after them, for these last are separate both in time and nature, but the former are close to the workings, and so indivisible from them as to raise a question whether the working and the pleasure are identical. But pleasure does not seem to be an intellectual operation nor a faculty of perception, because that is absurd. But yet it gives some the impression of being the same from not being separated from these. As then the workings are different, so are their pleasures. Now sight differs from touch and purity, and hearing and smelling from taste. Therefore, in like manner, do their pleasures, and again, intellectual pleasures from these sensual, and the different kinds both of intellectual and sensual from one another. It is thought, moreover, that each animal has a pleasure proper to itself, as it has a proper work, that pleasure of course which is attendant on the working. And the soundness of this will appear upon particular inspection, for horse, dog, and man have different pleasures. As Heraclitus says, an ass would sooner have hay than gold. In other words, provender is pleasanter to asses than gold. So then the pleasures of animals specifically different are also specifically different, but those of the same, we may reasonably suppose, are without difference. Yet in the case of human creatures they differ not a little. For the very same things please some and pain others, and what are painful and hateful to some are pleasant to and liked by others. The same is the case with sweet things. The same will not seem so to the man in a fever as to him who is in health, nor will the invalid and the person in robust health have the same notion of warmth. The same is the case with other things also. Now in all such cases that is held to be which impresses the good man with the notion of being such and such. And if this is a second maxim, as it is usually held to be, and virtue, that is, the good man, and that he is such, is the measure of everything, then those must be real pleasures which gave him the impression of being so, and those things pleasant in which he takes pleasure. Nor is it at all astonishing that what are to him unpleasant should give another person the impression of being pleasant, for men are liable to many corruptions and marrings, and the things in question are not pleasant really, only to these particular persons, and to them only as being thus disposed. Well, of course, you may say, it is obvious that we must assert those which are confessedly disgraceful to be real pleasures, except to depraved tastes. But of those which are thought to be good, what kind, or which, must we say is the pleasure of man? Is not the answer plain from considering the workings, because the pleasures follow upon these? If then there be one or several workings which belong to the perfect and blessed man, the pleasures which perfect these workings must be said to be specially and properly the pleasures of man, and all the rest in a secondary sense, and in various degrees according as the workings are related to those highest and best ones. Chapter 5. Now that we have spoken about the excellences of both kinds, and friendship in its varieties, and pleasures, it remains to sketch out happiness, since we assume that to be the one end of all human things, and we shall save time and trouble by recapitulating what was stated before. Well then, we said that it is not a state merely, because if it were, it might belong to one who slept all his life through and merely vegetated, or to one who fell into very great calamities. And so, if these possibilities displease us and we would rather put it into the rank of some kind of working, as was also said before, and workings are of different kinds, some being necessary and choice-worthy with a view to other things, while others are so in themselves, it is plain we must rank happiness among those choice-worthy for their own sakes and not among those which are so with a view to something further, because happiness has no lack of anything but is self-sufficient. By choice-worthy in themselves are meant those from which nothing is sought beyond the act of working, and of this kind are thought to be the actions according to virtue, because doing what is noble and excellent is one of those things which are choice-worthy for their own sake alone. And again, such amusements as are pleasant, because people do not choose them with any further purpose. In fact, they receive more harm than profit from them, neglecting their persons and their property. Still the common run of those who are judged happy take refuge in such pastimes, which is the reason why they who have varied talent in such are highly esteemed among despots, because they make themselves pleasant in those things which these aim at, and these accordingly want such men. Now these things are thought to be appurtenances of happiness because men in power spend their leisure herein. Yet, it may be, we cannot argue from the example of such men, because there is neither virtue nor intellect necessarily involved in having power, and yet these are the only sources of good workings, nor does it follow that because these men, never having tasted pure and generous pleasure, take refuge in bodily ones, we are therefore to believe them to be more choice-worthy, for children too believe that those things are most excellent which are precious in their eyes. We may well believe that as children and men have different ideas as to what is precious, so too have the bad and the good. Therefore, as we have many times said, those things are really precious and pleasant which seem so to the good man, and as to each individual that working is most choice-worthy which is in accordance with his own state, to the good man that is so which is in accordance with virtue. Happiness then stands not in amusement. In fact, the very notion is absurd of the end being amusement, and of one's toiling and enduring hardness all one's life long with a view to amusement. For everything in the world, so to speak, we choose with some further end in view, except happiness, for that is the end comprehending all others. Now to take pains and to labor with a view to amusement is plainly foolish and very childish. But to amuse one's self with a view to steady employment afterwards, as Anacharsis says, is thought to be right. For amusement is like rest, and men want rest because unable to labor continuously. Rest, therefore, is not an end, because it is adopted with a view to working afterwards. Again, it is held that the happy life must be won in the way of excellence, and this is accompanied by earnestness, and stands not in amusement. Moreover, those things which are done in earnest, we say, are better than things merely ludicrous and joined with amusement, and we say that the working of the better part, or the better man, is more earnest, and the working of the better is at once better and more capable of happiness. Then, again, as for bodily pleasures, any ordinary person, or even a slave, might enjoy them, just as well as the best man living, but happiness no one supposes a slave to share except so far as it is implied in life, because happiness stands not in such pastimes but in the workings in the way of excellence, as has also been stated before. Chapter 6. Now, if happiness is a working in the way of excellence, of course that excellence must be the highest, that is to say, the excellence of the best principle. Whether then this best principle is intellect, or some other which is thought naturally to rule and to lead and to conceive of noble and divine things, whether being in its own nature divine or the most divine of all our internal principles, the working of this in accordance with its own proper excellence must be the perfect happiness. That it is contemplative has been already stated, and this would seem to be consistent with what we said before and with truth, for, in the first place, this working is of the highest kind, since the intellect is the highest of our internal principles and the subjects with which it is conversant the highest of all which fall within the range of our knowledge. Next, it is also most continuous, for we are better able to contemplate than to do anything else whatever, continuously. Again, we think pleasure must be in some way an ingredient in happiness, and of all workings in accordance with excellence that in the way of science is confessedly most pleasant, at least the pursuit of science is thought to contain pleasures admirable for purity and permanence, and it is reasonable to suppose that the employment is more pleasant to those who have mastered than to those who are yet seeking for it. And the self-sufficiency which people speak of will attach chiefly to the contemplative working. Of course, the actual necessaries of life are needed alike by the man of science, and the just man, and all the other characters. But, supposing all sufficiently supplied with these, the just man needs people towards whom, and in concert with whom, to practice his justice, and in like manner the man of perfected self-mastery, and the brave man, and so on of the rest, whereas the man of science can contemplate and speculate even when quite alone, and the more entirely he deserves the appellation the more able is he to do so. It may be he can do better for having fellow workers, but still he is certainly most self-sufficient. Again, this alone would seem to be rested in for its own sake, since nothing results from it beyond the fact of having contemplated, whereas from all things which are objects of moral action we do mean to get something beside the doing them, be the same more or less. Also, happiness is thought to stand in perfect rest, for we toil that we may rest, and war that we may be at peace. Now all the practical virtues require either society or war for their working, and the actions regarding these are thought to exclude rest, those of war entirely, because no one chooses war, nor prepares for war's sake. He would indeed be thought a bloodthirsty villain who should make enemies of his friends to secure the existence of fighting and bloodshed. The working also of the statesman excludes the idea of rest, and beside the actual work of government, seeks for power and dignities or at least happiness for the man himself and his fellow citizens, a happiness distinct from the national happiness, which we evidently seek as being different and distinct. If then of all the actions in accordance with the various virtues those of policy and war are preeminent in honor and greatness, and these are restless, and aim at some further end and are not choice-worthy for their own sakes, but the working of the intellect, being apt for contemplation, is thought to excel in earnestness, and to aim at no end beyond itself and to have pleasure of its own which helps to increase the working. And if the attributes of self-sufficiency, and capacity of rest, and unweariedness, as far as is compatible with the infirmity of human nature, and all other attributes of the highest happiness, plainly belong to this working, this must be perfect happiness, if attaining a complete duration of life, which condition is added because none of the points of happiness is incomplete. But such a life will be higher than mere human nature, because a man will live thus, not in so far as he is man but in so far as there is in him a divine principle, and in proportion as this principle excels his composite nature so far does the working thereof excel that in accordance with any other kind of excellence, and therefore, if pure intellect, as compared with human nature, is divine, so too will the life in accordance with it be divine compared with man's ordinary life. Yet must we not give ear to those who bid one as man to mind only man's affairs, or as mortal only mortal things, but, so far as we can, make ourselves like immortals and do all with a view to living in accordance with the highest principle in us, for small as it may be in bulk yet in power and preciousness it far more excels all the others. In fact, this principle would seem to constitute each man's self. Since it is supreme and above all others in goodness, it would be absurd then for a man not to choose his own life but that of some other. And here we'll apply an observation made before, that whatever is proper to each is naturally best and pleasantest to him. Such then is to man the life in accordance with pure intellect, since this principle is most truly man, and if so, then it is also the happiest. And second in degree of happiness will be that life which is in accordance with the other kind of excellence, for the workings in accordance with this are proper to man. I mean, we do actions of justice, courage, and the other virtues, towards one another, in contracts, services of different kinds, and in all kinds of actions and feelings too, by observing what is befitting for each, and all these plainly are proper to man. Further, the excellence of the moral character is thought to result in some points from physical circumstances, and to be, in many, very closely connected with the passions. Again, practical wisdom and excellence of the moral character are very closely united, since the principles of practical wisdom are in accordance with the moral virtues, and these are right when they accord with practical wisdom. These, moreover, as bound up with the passions, must belong to the composite nature, and the excellences or virtues of the composite nature are proper to man. Therefore so too will be the life and happiness which is in accordance with them. But that of the pure intellect is separate and distinct, and let this suffice upon the subject, since great exactness is beyond our purpose. It would seem, moreover, to require supply of external goods to a small degree, or certainly less than the moral happiness, for, as far as necessaries of life are concerned, we will suppose both characters to need them equally, though, in point of fact, the man who lives in society does take more pains about his person and all that kind of thing. There will really be some little difference. But when we come to consider their workings, there will be found a great difference. I mean, the liberal man must have money to do his liberal actions with, and the just man to meet his engagements, for mere intentions are uncertain, and even those who are unjust make a pretense of wishing to do justly, and the brave man must have power, if he is to perform any of the actions which appertain to his particular virtue, and the man of perfected self-mastery must have opportunity of temptation. Else how shall he or any of the others display his real character? By the way, a question is sometimes raised, whether the moral choice or the actions have most to do with virtue, since it consists in both. It is plain that the perfection of virtuous action requires both. But for the actions many things are required, and the greater and more numerous they are the more. But as for the man engaged in contemplative speculation, not only are such things unnecessary for his working, but, so to speak, they are even hindrances, as regards the contemplation at least. Because of course in so far as he is man and lives in society he chooses to do what virtue requires, and so he will need such things for maintaining his character as man though not as a speculative philosopher. And that the perfect happiness must be a kind of contemplative working may appear also from the following consideration. Our conception of the gods is that they are above all blessed and happy. Now what kind of moral actions are we to attribute to them? Those of justice? Nay, will they not be set in a ridiculous light if represented as forming contracts, and restoring deposits, and so on? Well then, shall we picture them performing brave actions, withstanding objects of fear and meeting dangers, because it is noble to do so? Or liberal ones? But to whom shall they be giving? And further, it is absurd to think they have money or anything of the kind. And as for actions of perfected self-mastery, what can theirs be? Would it not be a degrading praise that they have no bad desires? In short, if one followed the subject into all details, all the circumstances connected with moral actions would appear trivial and unworthy of gods. Still, every one believes that they live, and therefore that they work, because it is not supposed that they sleep their time away like Endymion. Now if from a living being you take away action, still more if creation, what remains but contemplation? So then the working of the gods, eminent in blessedness, will be one apt for contemplative speculation, and of all human workings that will have the greatest capacity for happiness which is nearest akin to this. A corroboration of which position is the fact that the other animals do not partake of happiness, being completely shut out from any such working. To the gods then all their life is blessed, and to men in so far as there is in it some copy of such working, but of the other animals none is happy because it in no way shares in contemplative speculation. Happiness then is coextensive with this contemplative speculation, and in proportion as people have the act of contemplation, so far have they also the being happy, not incidentally, but in the way of contemplative speculation, because it is in itself precious. Chapter 7. So happiness must be a kind of contemplative speculation. But since it is man we are speaking of, he will need likewise external prosperity, because his nature is not by itself sufficient for speculation, but there must be health of body, and nourishment, and tendance of all kinds. However, it must not be thought, because without external goods a man cannot enjoy high happiness, that therefore he will require many and great goods in order to be happy, for neither self-sufficiency, nor action, stand in excess, and it is quite possible to act nobly without being ruler of sea and land, since even with moderate means a man may act in accordance with virtue. And this may be clearly seen in that men in private stations are thought to act justly, not merely no less than men in power, but even more. It will be quite enough that just so much should belong to a man as is necessary, for his life will be happy who works in accordance with virtue. Solon perhaps drew a fair picture of the happy, when he said that they are men moderately supplied with external goods, and who have achieved the most noble deeds, as he thought, and who have lived with perfect self-mastery, for it is quite possible for men of moderate means to act as they ought. Anaxagoras also seems to have conceived of the happy man not as either rich or powerful, saying that he should not wonder if he were accounted a strange man in the judgment of the multitude, for they judge by outward circumstances of which alone they have any perception. And thus the opinions of the wise seem to be accordant with our account of the matter. Of course such things carry some weight, but truth, in matters of moral action, is judged from facts and from actual life, for herein rests the decision. So what we should do is to examine the preceding statements by referring them to facts and to actual life, and when they harmonize with facts we may accept them, when they are at variance with them conceive of them as mere theories. Now he that works in accordance with, and pays observance to, pure intellect, and tends this, seems likely to be both in the best frame of mind and dearest to the gods. Because if, as is thought, any care is bestowed on human things by the gods, then it must be reasonable to think that they take pleasure in what is best and most akin to themselves, and this must be the pure intellect. And that they requite with kindness those who love and honor this most, as paying observance to what is dear to them, and as acting rightly and nobly. And it is quite obvious that the man of science chiefly combines all these, he is therefore dearest to the gods, and it is probable that he is at the same time most happy. Thus then on this view also the man of science will be most happy. Chapter 8. Now then that we have said enough in our sketchy kind of way on these subjects, I mean, on the virtues, and also on friendship and pleasure, are we to suppose that our original purpose is completed? Must we not rather acknowledge, what is commonly said, that in matters of moral action mere speculation and knowledge is not the real end but rather practice? And if so, then neither in respect of virtue is knowledge enough. We must further strive to have and exert it, and take whatever other means there are of becoming good. Now if talking and writing were of themselves sufficient to make men good, they would justly, as Theognis observes, have reaped numerous and great rewards, and the thing to do would be to provide them. But in point of fact, while they plainly have the power to guide and stimulate the generous among the young and to base upon true virtuous principle any noble and truly high-minded disposition, they as plainly are powerless to guide the mass of men to virtue and goodness, because it is not their nature to be amenable to a sense of shame but only to fear, nor to abstain from what is low and mean because it is disgraceful to do it but because of the punishment attached to it. In fact, as they live at the beck and call of passion, they pursue their own proper pleasures and the means of securing them, and they avoid the contrary pains. But as for what is noble and truly pleasurable, they have not an idea of it, inasmuch as they have never tasted of it. Men such as these then what mere words can transform? No, indeed. It is either actually impossible, or a task of no mean difficulty, to alter by words what has been of old taken into men's very dispositions. And it may be, it is a ground for contentment if with all the means and appliances for goodness in our hands we can attain to virtue. The formation of a virtuous character some ascribe to nature, some to custom, and some to teaching. Now nature's part, be it what it may, obviously does not rest with us, but belongs to those who in the truest sense are fortunate, by reason of certain divine agency. Then, as for words and precept, they, it is to be feared, will not avail with all, but it may be necessary for the mind of the disciple to have been previously prepared for liking and disliking as he ought, just as the soil must, to nourish the seed sown. For he that lives in obedience to passion cannot hear any advice that would dissuade him, nor, if he heard, understand, now him that is thus how can one reform? In fact, generally, passion is not thought to yield to reason but to brute force. So then there must be, to begin with, a kind of affinity to virtue in the disposition, which must cleave to what is honorable and loathe what is disgraceful. But to get right guidance towards virtue from the earliest youth is not easy unless one is brought up under laws of such kind, because living with self-mastery and endurance is not pleasant to the mass of men, and especially not to the young. For this reason the food, and manner of living generally, ought to be the subject of legal regulation, because things when become habitual will not be disagreeable. Yet perhaps it is not sufficient that men while young should get right food and tendance, but, inasmuch as they will have to practice and become accustomed to certain things even after they have attained to man's estate, we shall want laws on these points as well, and in fine, respecting one's whole life, since the mass of men are amenable to compulsion rather than reason, and to punishment rather than to a sense of honor. And therefore some men hold that while lawgivers should employ the sense of honor to exhort and guide men to virtue, under the notion that they will then obey who have been well trained in habits, they should impose chastisement and penalties on those who disobey and are of less promising nature, and the incurable expel entirely, because the good man and he who lives under a sense of honor will be obedient to reason, and the baser sort, who grasp at pleasure, will be kept in check like beasts of burthen by pain. Therefore also they say that the pains should be such as are most contrary to the pleasures which are liked. As has been said already, he who is to be good must have been brought up and habituated well, and then live accordingly under good institutions, and never do what is low and mean, either against or with his will. Now these objects can be attained only by men living in accordance with some guiding intellect and right order, with power to back them. As for the paternal rule, it possesses neither strength nor compulsory power, nor in fact does the rule of any one man, unless he is a king or someone in like case. But the law has power to compel, since it is a declaration emanating from practical wisdom and intellect. And people feel enmity towards their fellow men who oppose their impulses, however rightly they may do so. The law, on the contrary, is not the object of hatred, though enforcing right rules. The Lacedaemonian is nearly the only state in which the framer of the Constitution has made any provision, it would seem, respecting the food and manner of living of the people. In most states these points are entirely neglected, and each man lives just as he likes, ruling his wife and children Cyclops fashion. Of course, the best thing would be that there should be a right public system and that we should be able to carry it out. But since as a public matter those points are neglected, the duty would seem to devolve upon each individual to contribute to the cause of virtue with his own children and friends, or at least to make this his aim and purpose. And this, it would seem, from what has been said, he will be best able to do by making a legislator of himself, since all public systems, it is plain, are formed by the instrumentality of laws, and those are good which are formed by that of good laws, whether they are written or unwritten, whether they are applied to the training of one or many, will not, it seems, make any difference, just as it does not in music, gymnastics, or any other such accomplishments, which are gained by practice. For just as in communities laws and customs prevail, so too in families the express commands of the head, and customs also, and even more in the latter, because of blood relationship and the benefits conferred. For there you have, to begin with, people who have affection and are naturally obedient to the authority which controls them. Then, furthermore, private training has advantages over public, as in the case of the healing art, for instance. As a general rule, a man who is in a fever should keep quiet and starve. But in a particular case, perhaps, this may not hold good, or, to take a different illustration, the boxer will not use the same way of fighting with all antagonists. It would seem then that the individual will be most exactly attended to under private care, because so each will be more likely to obtain what is expedient for him. Of course, whether in the art of healing, or gymnastics, or any other, a man will treat individual cases the better for being acquainted with general rules. As, that so and so is good for all, or for men in such and such cases. Because general maxims are not only said to be but are the object matter of sciences, still this is no reason against the possibility of a man's taking excellent care of some one case, though he possesses no scientific knowledge but from experience is exactly acquainted with what happens in each point, just as some people are thought to doctor themselves best though they would be wholly unable to administer relief to others. Yet it may seem to be necessary nevertheless, for one who wishes to become a real artist and well acquainted with the theory of his profession, to have recourse to general principles and ascertain all their capacities, for we have already stated that these are the object matter of sciences. If then it appears that we may become good through the instrumentality of laws, of course whoso wishes to make men better by a system of care and training must try to make a legislator of himself. For to treat skillfully just any one who may be put before you is not what any ordinary person can do, but if any one, he who has knowledge, as in the healing art, and all others which involve careful practice and skill. Will not then our next business be to inquire from what sources, or how one may acquire this faculty of legislation? Or shall we say, that, as in similar cases, statesmen are the people to learn from, since this faculty was thought to be a part of the social science? Must we not admit that the political science plainly does not stand on a similar footing to that of other sciences and faculties? I mean, that while in all other cases those who impart the faculties and themselves exert them are identical, physicians and painters for instance, matters of statesmanship the sophists profess to teach, but not one of them practices it, that being left to those actually engaged in it, and these might really very well be thought to do it by some singular knack and by mere practice rather than by any intellectual process. For they neither write nor speak on these matters, though it might be more to their credit than composing speeches for the courts or the assembly, nor again have they made statesmen of their own sons or their friends. One can hardly suppose but that they would have done so if they could, seeing that they could have bequeathed no more precious legacy to their communities, nor would they have preferred, for themselves or their dearest friends, the possession of any faculty rather than this. Practice, however, seems to contribute no little to its acquisition. Merely breathing the atmosphere of politics would never have made statesmen of them, and therefore we may conclude that they who would acquire a knowledge of statesmanship must have in addition practice. But of the sophists they who profess to teach it are plainly a long way off from doing so. In fact, they have no knowledge at all of its nature and objects. If they had, they would never have put it on the same footing with rhetoric, or even on a lower. Either would they have conceived it to be an easy matter to legislate by simply collecting such laws as are famous because of course one could select the best. As though the selection were not a matter of skill, and the judging a right of very great matter, as in music, for they alone, who have practical knowledge of a thing, can judge the performances rightly or understand with what means and in what way they are accomplished, and what harmonizes with what. The unlearned must be content with being able to discover whether the result is good or bad, as in painting. Now laws may be called the performances or tangible results of political science. How then can a man acquire from these the faculty of legislation, or choose the best? We do not see men made physicians by compilations, and yet in these treatises men endeavor to give not only the cases but also how they may be cured, and the proper treatment in each case, dividing the various bodily habits. Well, these are thought to be useful to professional men, but to the unprofessional useless. In like manner it may be that collections of laws and constitutions would be exceedingly useful to such as are able to speculate on them, and judge what is well, and what ill, and what kind of things fit in with what others. But they who without this qualification should go through such matters cannot have right judgment, unless they have it by instinct, though they may become more intelligent in such matters. Since then those who have preceded us have left uninvestigated the subject of legislation, it will be better perhaps for us to investigate it ourselves. And in fact, the whole subject of polity, that thus what we may call human philosophy may be completed as far as in us lies. First then, let us endeavor to get whatever fragments of good there may be in the statements of our predecessors. Next, from the polities we have collected, ascertain what kind of things preserve or destroy communities, and what particular constitutions, and the cause why some are well and others ill managed, for after such inquiry, we shall be the better able to take a concentrated view as to what kind of constitution is best, what kind of regulations are best for each, and what laws and customs